Every night, my father handed me a small white pill and a glass of water, watching my throat closely until I swallowed it down completely. He swore the medication was strictly necessary to help me heal from the devastating car crash that had nearly taken my life. But one evening, I tucked that little pill safely under my tongue instead. When I crept downstairs, well past midnight, the horrible truth I discovered waiting in the dark was far more lethal than any shattered windshield. My father was not trying to heal me, and he was not acting alone tonight. The bitter taste of the dissolving capsule burned sharply against the roof of my mouth as I lay perfectly still in the dark. I waited patiently until the heavy oak door of my bedroom clicked firmly shut. I listened closely to my father walking away as his footsteps faded down the long hallway of our massive family estate. Only then did I turn my head slowly and spit the half-melted pill into a soft tissue I had hidden securely inside my cast. My chest ached deeply with every single breath I took. My ribs were still wrapped incredibly tight from the brutal collision just 3 short weeks ago. The police had called it a tragic mechanical malfunction. They said the brakes on my Porsche simply gave out unexpectedly. I had believed them. I had also believed my husband Preston when he wept loudly by my hospital bed, holding my hand and promising to handle everything at my venture capital firm while I recovered. I had foolishly believed my father Richard when he forcefully insisted I move back into my childhood home so he could personally oversee my extensive medical care. I was 34 years old, managing a multi-billion-dollar investment portfolio, but in this quiet house, I was suddenly reduced to a helpless child again. For 3 long weeks, I spent my days floating in a dense chemical haze, sleeping directly through important board meetings, missing urgent conference calls, and blindly signing whatever legal documents Preston placed directly in front of me. They continuously said the heavy medication was absolutely necessary for managing the severe physical trauma. But tonight, the thick mental fog was finally lifting. My mind felt incredibly sharp, extremely clear, and highly dangerous. The massive grandfather clock standing in the front foyer softly chimed 1 in the morning. I carefully pushed the heavy down duvet completely off my injured legs. The pain shooting through my shattered right knee was a sharp, blinding flash, but I bit the soft inside of my cheek to successfully keep from making even a single sound. I slowly forced myself to stand upright. The plush hallway carpet fully absorbed my uneven footsteps as I made my steady way out of the dark bedroom and directly into the pitch-black corridor. The massive house was supposed to be completely asleep right now. Preston had specifically told me earlier he was staying far away at our city penthouse tonight to independently prepare for an early morning board meeting. My aging father usually retired to bed strictly by 10, but as I finally reached the carpeted top of the grand wooden staircase, I suddenly saw a thin sliver of warm golden light brightly spilling out from directly beneath the heavy mahogany doors of my father's ground floor study. I tightly gripped the polished wooden banister. Every painful step down those stairs was a dangerously calculated risk. My bare feet made absolutely no sound, but my racing heart hammered so violently against my deeply bruised ribs, I honestly thought they might hear it echoing right through the solid wood. I successfully reached the bottom of the stairs and quietly pressed my back flat against the cool plaster wall, carefully inching closer to the slightly ajar door. The rich, familiar scent of expensive scotch and burning cigar smoke drifted steadily out. Then I clearly heard a sound that instantly made my warm blood freeze solid. It was a careless laugh, a deep, incredibly familiar laugh that undoubtedly belonged to the very man I had happily married 5 wonderful years ago. Preston was absolutely supposed to be many miles away. I very carefully angled my head to peer quietly through the narrow, vertical gap between the heavy wooden doors. The study was currently lit only by the low orange glow of the roaring fireplace and a single green desk lamp. My father proudly stood by the vintage leather sofa, casually holding a heavy crystal decanter. He smoothly poured a very generous measure of fine scotch directly into 2 separate glasses. Preston was sitting incredibly relaxed in my father's favorite armchair, with his legs casually crossed, looking completely at home here. My father handed Preston a glass, and they joyfully clinked them together in a silent celebratory toast. "She took the pill without a fight tonight," my father said, taking a slow, satisfying sip of his amber drink. "The new dosage is working perfectly because she barely asked any questions when I brought her the tea." Preston swirled the expensive liquid gracefully in his glass, flashing a chilling smile I had truly never seen before. It was remarkably cold and utterly devoid of the tender warmth he usually showed me privately. "Excellent," Preston replied softly. "We simply cannot afford any resistance right now, so tell me, have you reviewed those final drafts from Dr. Evans?" My father walked around the massive desk and quickly picked up a thick manila folder, tossing it onto the table right in front of Preston. "Evans completely signed off on everything this afternoon, so the psychiatric evaluation is now legally bulletproof, declaring Victoria entirely mentally unfit to manage her vast finances." I stopped breathing completely, as the solid wooden floor beneath my bare feet felt exactly like it was suddenly dropping away. I silently vowed right then to brutally destroy them both for orchestrating this truly unforgivable, corporate and personal betrayal tonight. The morning sunlight pouring through the sheer linen curtains of my childhood bedroom felt entirely like a cruel joke today. It was a beautiful, crisp autumn morning outside, but inside these four walls, I was effectively a hostage. I lay perfectly still under the heavy down comforter, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the antique wall clock. My shattered knee throbbed with a dull, relentless ache, and my ribs felt like they were bound in tight iron bands. But the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the cold terror gripping my chest. I had barely slept a single hour after creeping back into bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I vividly saw my father and my husband clinking their crystal glasses together in the dark study downstairs, celebrating my legally engineered demise. The psychiatric evaluation declaring me mentally unfit was already signed and sealed by a doctor my father had undoubtedly bribed. They thought I was completely broken. They thought I was a heavily medicated pawn in their billion-dollar chess game. I slowly took a deep, steadying breath, forcing my racing heart to slow down. I needed to survive this morning. I had spent 15 years building my venture capital firm from the ground up, ruthlessly negotiating with the most aggressive sharks in Silicon Valley. I knew exactly how to wear a mask. Today, my survival depended entirely on playing the tragic, heavily medicated victim they desperately needed me to be. The heavy brass handle of my bedroom door slowly turned, and I instantly let my eyelids droop halfway. I relaxed every muscle in my face, allowing my jaw to go slightly slack to mimic the heavy sedation of the pills I had secretly spit out last night. My father, Richard, walked into the room carrying a silver tray. He looked exactly like the distinguished real estate tycoon the city magazines always praised, wearing his crisp, tailored trousers and a cashmere sweater. He set the heavy tray gently on the wooden nightstand. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet paternal warmth that made my stomach physically churn. "I brought your favorite chamomile tea and your morning medication." I forced myself to let out a weak, groggy moan, slowly turning my head toward him, as if the simple movement took monumental effort. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered, making sure my words slurred just a tiny bit. My father smiled down at me, a terrifyingly gentle smile that completely masked the financial ruin he was currently facing. He poured the hot tea into a porcelain cup. "You need to keep your strength up, Victoria," he murmured softly. "The doctor said your recovery will be long and difficult, but Preston and I are going to handle absolutely everything for you." I reached out with a trembling hand, taking the warm teacup. I knew I had to drink it to maintain the illusion, so I took a slow sip, forcing the bitter liquid down my throat, while looking up at him with wide, grateful eyes. Right on cue, the bedroom door opened wider, and my husband Preston strolled in. He was dressed impeccably in a custom navy suit, looking perfectly rested and impossibly handsome. The sharp contrast between his vibrant, healthy energy and my broken, battered state was stark. He walked straight over to the bed and leaned down, pressing a warm, lingering kiss against my forehead. The touch of his lips sent a violent shudder of absolute revulsion down my spine, but I quickly disguised it as a painful shiver from the cold air. "Good morning," my beautiful wife Preston said softly, brushing a stray lock of hair away from my face. "How are you feeling today?" I blinked slowly, staring up at the man I had trusted with my life and my heart for 5 entire years. The man who had likely paid someone to cut the brake lines on my sports car 3 weeks ago. "I feel so tired, Preston," I murmured, leaning my head back against the thick pillows. My head is just constantly spinning from all these heavy painkillers. Preston exchanged a remarkably brief, knowing glance with my father over my head. It was a tiny micro-expression of triumph, but I caught it perfectly. "That is exactly why you need to just rest, Victoria," Preston said smoothly, sitting carefully on the edge of my mattress. "You have absolutely nothing to worry about in the outside world right now. Your health is the only thing that truly matters." I closed my eyes for a brief second, silently calculating my exact next move. I was completely trapped in this house, with no access to my regular attorneys and surrounded by enemies. Preston gently patted my hand, his thumb rhythmically stroking my knuckles in a gesture that used to bring me immense comfort. "By the way, darling," he said, his tone shifting to something casually dismissive, as if he was merely mentioning the weather. "I need to run over to the firm later this afternoon just to handle some incredibly minor administrative expenses while you rest. Just keeping the lights on and paying the basic vendor invoices so you do not have to stress about it." My blood ran completely cold. I knew exactly what those minor expenses actually were. He was preparing to wire $40 million of my liquid assets into my father's offshore accounts to save the failing real estate empire. "I actually need to grab your biometric thumb drive from your safe." Preston continued smoothly, his eyes remaining completely fixed on my face, watching closely for any sign of resistance. "The bank is being ridiculously stubborn about the new security protocols for the corporate accounts, and they need your direct encrypted authorization to clear the payroll checks. Just give me the combination to the wall safe, and I will take care of all this boring paperwork for you." The sheer audacity of his request was staggering. The biometric drive contained the master encryption keys to every single offshore trust and venture capital fund I managed. Handing it over would give him total, unrestricted access to my entire financial empire. My father stood quietly by the window, watching me with predatory intensity while pretending to admire the garden. The heavy silence in the room stretched out for a terrifying moment. If I flatly refused, he would instantly know the heavy medication was not working, and my life would be in immediate physical danger. If I gave him the correct combination, my life's work would be instantly liquidated by noon. I let out a soft, pathetic sigh, staring blankly at the ceiling to maintain the illusion of my drugged confusion, while my mind raced at lightning speed to construct the perfect trap. I stared blankly at Preston while he waited patiently for the combination to my wall safe. My mind was operating with absolute clarity, despite the heavy fog I was pretending to be lost inside. I knew the biometric drive he wanted was sitting right on the middle shelf next to my passport. I also knew the security protocols of my venture capital firm better than anyone else in the world. The safe required a 6-digit code. If the wrong code was entered 3 consecutive times, the internal system would trigger an automatic 24-hour electronic lockout. I let my eyes flutter shut for a moment, acting as though the effort of remembering was simply too much for my heavily medicated brain. 482199, I whispered softly. Preston smiled a brilliant, wide smile and quickly walked over to the hidden panel behind the large oil painting on the far wall. He punched the numbers into the sleek metal keypad. A sharp red light blinked instantly, followed by a low, angry beep indicating an incorrect entry. He frowned slightly and looked back at me over his tailored shoulder. "Are you absolutely sure about those numbers, Victoria?" He asked, his tone tight with suddenly poorly concealed irritation. "Try it again," I mumbled weakly. shifting my weight on the mattress and letting out a soft groan of manufactured pain. I must have mixed up the last 2 digits because my head is just pounding so badly right now. He quickly typed the exact same sequence again. Another sharp red light. Another angry beep. My father stepped forward from the window, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle ticking furiously beneath his skin. "Let me try it," Richard said sharply. He pushed Preston aside and aggressively entered the numbers for the 3rd and final time. The keypad immediately flashed a solid blinding red, and a computerized voice announced the system was completely locked down for the next 24 hours due to suspicious activity. Preston swore loudly, forgetting his loving husband act for a split second. He slammed his hand hard against the heavy steel door. My father glared at him warningly and then immediately smoothed his expression back into a mask of deep paternal concern as he turned toward my bed. "It is perfectly fine, sweetheart," my father said smoothly. "We can easily get the drive tomorrow morning when the system resets itself." My father continued, his voice thick with fake reassurance. "You clearly just need a lot more rest today." He gestured for Preston to follow him out of the bedroom. Preston walked over and kissed my cheek one last time, but I could feel the rigid tension vibrating through his entire body. "Just sleep, darling," he whispered coldly. "We will handle all the stressful business details tomorrow." They finally walked out, and the heavy bedroom door clicked securely shut behind them. I heard the distinct sound of the deadbolt sliding into place from the outside. They were locking me in for my own safety, of course. I lay completely still for 10 full minutes, just listening to the silence. Once I was absolutely certain they were gone, I slowly pushed the heavy blankets aside. I ignored the blinding pain radiating from my shattered knee and focused entirely on the bulky fiberglass cast tightly encasing my right leg. During my 2nd week in the hospital, right before my father forced me to move back into this isolated estate, I had bribed a sympathetic night nurse. For $10,000 transferred directly into her student loan account, she had carefully embedded a small waterproof compartment deep inside the thick plaster of my cast. I reached down and dug my fingernails into the specific groove near my ankle. The small concealed latch gave way with a satisfying click. I pulled out a sleek black burner phone that was fully charged and completely untraceable. This cheap plastic device was my only remaining lifeline to the outside world. I quickly powered it on and connected to the hidden cellular network I had established years ago for emergency corporate security. I bypassed the standard firm portal and accessed the encrypted back-end server directly through a command line interface. The bright green text reflected sharply in my eyes as I typed in my master administrative credentials. The system authenticated my identity, and I immediately pulled up the global transaction logs for my personal venture capital portfolio. My heart pounded fiercely against my bruised ribs as the massive ledger populated on the small glowing screen. I needed to see exactly how much damage Preston had tried to do while I was trapped in this chemical prison. The most recent pending transaction sat right at the very top of the screen, flashing in bright, warning yellow. It was an outbound wire transfer request, initiated just 2 hours ago from Preston, using a forged digital signature. The requested amount was exactly $40 million. I stared at the massive number, feeling a wave of absolute disgust wash over me. The destination routing number belonged to a private offshore trust registered in the Cayman Islands. I ran a quick database search on the shell company listed on the account, and the ultimate beneficiary name popped up instantly. It was my father. They were not just trying to slowly drain my assets over time to save his failing real estate empire. They were attempting a massive immediate liquidation. If that fraudulent transfer had successfully cleared today, my entire firm would have been completely paralyzed by tomorrow morning. I realized with chilling clarity that my fake 24-hour lockout had quite literally saved my entire financial legacy. I had successfully bought myself exactly 1 day to dismantle their entire conspiracy and secure my survival. Tomorrow morning, Preston would demand the correct safe combination again, and he would absolutely not accept any more convenient mistakes from a heavily medicated wife. I needed to act right now. I stared at the glowing screen of the black burner phone resting in my trembling hands. The immediate threat of the fraudulent $40 million wire transfer was temporarily neutralized by the system lockout, but the larger war for my survival had just begun. I needed a lawyer right now. I did not just need any corporate lawyer, but a ruthless predator who understood exactly how to dismantle a massive financial conspiracy from the inside out. My very first instinct was to call the general counsel of my own venture capital firm. We had worked closely together for 8 highly successful years. But as I opened the encrypted messaging application, I froze completely. My father, Richard Sterling, was a legacy real estate tycoon with incredibly deep political and social connections across the entire city. If he had already successfully arranged a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation from a highly respected medical professional, he had absolutely already compromised my corporate legal team. He would have easily fed my lawyers the exact same fabricated story about my severe mental decline following the brutal car crash. If I reached out to my own firm today, my general counsel would legally be obligated to report my erratic, paranoid behavior directly to my newly appointed conservator. And my legal conservator was my husband, Preston. I was entirely isolated in this massive house. My vast wealth and my corporate power were effectively locked inside a thick glass box that I could only tap against helplessly. I desperately needed an outside operative. I needed someone who operated entirely beyond my father's vast sphere of influence, and someone who fundamentally despised Preston as much as I currently did. There was exactly one person on the entire Eastern Seaboard who perfectly fit that incredibly specific description. That person was Marcus Hayes. Marcus was Preston's older brother, but they could not have been more fundamentally different if they had been born on entirely separate planets. While Preston had spent his entire adult life coasting effortlessly on his natural charm and the financial generosity of successful women like me, Marcus had carved his own brutal path to the absolute top of the legal food chain. Marcus was a fiercely intelligent African-American corporate litigator who had built his formidable national reputation by systematically tearing apart corrupt executives in high-stakes federal courtrooms. He had proudly walked away from the endless Hayes family toxicity more than a decade ago, refusing to enable his brother's parasitic lifestyle. At our lavish wedding 5 years ago, Marcus had stood quietly at the very back of the reception hall, nursing a single glass of neat bourbon. He had pulled me aside right before the elaborate cake-cutting ceremony and looked me dead in the eye. He told me I was a brilliant woman making a catastrophic emotional investment. He said his brother was a charming parasite who would eventually bleed me completely dry. I had been so blindly in love with Preston back then that I was deeply offended by his harsh, unsolicited warning. We had barely spoken a single word to each other since that night, but over the last 5 years, I had secretly followed his aggressive legal career with immense professional respect. Marcus did not care about polite social niceties or blind family loyalty. He cared exclusively about leverage, undeniable facts, and winning at all costs. I needed his ruthless, analytical mind right now, more than I needed oxygen in my lungs. I shifted my heavy weight on the soft mattress, carefully adjusting my broken leg to avoid aggravating the sharp pain radiating from my knee. I quickly typed a detailed message into the secure text application. I sent it directly to the private emergency cellular number I had quietly memorized from his law firm's internal security directory years ago. The message was brief and entirely devoid of any pathetic emotional appeal. I wrote Marcus, "This is Victoria and Preston, and my father are actively attempting a hostile takeover of my firm using a forged psychiatric conservatorship, so they have locked me inside the family estate, and I need immediate external legal representation." I told him to name his highest retainer fee, and I would happily double it. I hit send and watched the tiny digital checkmark turn bright green, indicating the encrypted message was successfully delivered. My racing heart pounded a frantic, uneven rhythm against my deeply bruised ribs as I waited in the deafening silence of my childhood bedroom. The tense seconds stretched out into agonizingly long minutes. I knew perfectly well that Marcus was an incredibly busy man, managing billion-dollar corporate lawsuits across the country. There was a very real, terrifying chance he would simply ignore the desperate plea of the foolish sister-in-law who had completely ignored his accurate warning 5 years ago. I kept my eyes glued to the small glowing screen, praying he would read the message before my father decided to check on me again. 10 long minutes later, the plastic burner phone vibrated silently in my sweaty palm. The caller identification displayed an unknown, completely blocked number. I answered the call immediately, pressing the cold plastic tightly against my ear, listening to the faint static on the line. Victoria, a deep, incredibly calm voice said on the other end. It was Marcus. His professional tone was entirely stripped of any surprise or warm familial greeting. It was the deeply calculated, steady voice of a lead federal prosecutor, stepping confidently into a courtroom. "Tell me exactly what you know, and do not leave out a single financial detail," he commanded softly. I took a deep, steadying breath and laid out the entire horrific situation with absolute clinical precision. I did not cry or complain once about the blinding physical pain in my shattered leg. I calmly told him about pretending to swallow the heavy sleeping pills last night. I described the late-night celebration in the dark study and the forged medical documents happily signed by Dr. Evans. I detailed Preston's brazen attempt to secure my biometric encryption drive this morning under the guise of paying minor vendor invoices. I proudly explained the temporary 24-hour security lockout I had deliberately triggered on my wall safe to buy myself time. Finally, I revealed the pending $40 million offshore wire transfer I had just discovered on the back-end server, waiting to save my father's bankrupt real estate empire. Marcus listened to my entire recounting in complete dead silence. He did not interrupt me once to offer empty sympathy or express any shock at his own brother's profound betrayal. When I finally finished detailing the exact banking routing numbers of my father's offshore shell company, Marcus let out a slow, measured breath. A medical conservatorship is the absolute perfect weapon for massive corporate theft, he said, his voice laced with dark, professional appreciation for the flawless criminal strategy. It allows them to bypass your standard board of directors and completely sidestep the strict corporate bylaws you established. By declaring you legally, mentally incapacitated, Preston automatically assumes emergency fiduciary control over your entire personal asset portfolio and your controlling voting shares. And because you are legally married to him, he does not even need to endure a lengthy public court battle to establish his temporary guardianship. Your father simply provides the fraudulent medical documentation, and Preston smoothly provides the unquestioned spousal authority. It is a highly efficient, completely closed loop of financial fraud. They are literally using your own massive wealth to pay for the expensive lawyers and corrupt doctors who are currently keeping you trapped inside that house. Can you legally break it? I asked him, my voice remaining perfectly steady, despite the cold, absolute terror gripping my empty stomach. I cannot safely access my regular corporate attorneys because my father will have already placed them on strict legal notice regarding my declining mental state. Any sudden move I make internally will be instantly flagged and blocked by the compliance department. I am entirely cut off from my own financial empire right now. Marcus paused for a moment, and I could practically hear his brilliant legal mind calculating the various angles and assessing the severe risk involved. Breaking a medical conservatorship from the outside is incredibly difficult when the wealthy patient is physically isolated and heavily medicated, he explained carefully. If I simply march into a downtown courtroom today and file an emergency injunction, your father will immediately present a massive mountain of forged clinical evidence proving you are a severe danger to yourself. The presiding judge will look at your recent traumatic car crash and naturally side with the deeply concerned, handsome husband and the wealthy, powerful father. We absolutely cannot fight them using a direct legal frontal assault, Victoria. We have to completely circumvent the conservatorship itself. We have to render Preston's new legal authority entirely useless before he even realizes what is happening. I need you to act as my proxy, Marcus, I said, gripping the plastic phone tighter until my knuckles turned bright white. I need you to be the hidden outside operative who quietly moves my assets out of the blast zone while I keep them totally distracted inside this house. I will grant you full, unmitigated power of attorney and whatever digital authorization you need to execute the massive transfers. I will play the heavily drugged and completely broken wife perfectly today. They will not suspect a single thing until our trap is already sprung. There was a very long, heavy silence on the line. I knew I was asking him to risk his immaculate professional reputation. If we failed Preston, and my father would easily frame us both for massive financial crimes, and Marcus could permanently lose his license to practice law. But I also knew that Marcus possessed a deep, fundamental hatred for arrogant men who constantly abused their unearned privilege. He absolutely despised his brother's endless entitlement and my father's blatant corruption. "You always were the smartest person in any room," Victoria Marcus finally said, his voice dropping lower with a deadly calm, chilling resolution. "You are literally the only person I know who could survive a targeted fatal car crash and immediately start planning a billion-dollar corporate counteroffensive from a locked childhood bedroom. Preston seriously underestimated your brilliant mind, and that will absolutely be his fatal mistake. I will take the case immediately. I will begin drafting the proxy documentation right now and establish a secure encrypted channel for us to entirely bypass your compromised firm servers. Do exactly what you have been doing all morning. Keep pretending to swallow those fake pills. Keep playing the weak, grateful victim. Give them absolutely no reason to accelerate their timeline or suspect you are awake. We have exactly 24 hours before Preston aggressively forces that wall safe open again. I reminded him the sheer urgency bleeding through my carefully constructed calm composure. Once he finally gets his hands on that biometric drive, he will drain the corporate accounts and burn the entire firm to the ground to save my father's real estate portfolio. I understand completely. Marcus replied, his deep tone radiating absolute, unwavering confidence and lethal intent. Let Preston foolishly believe he has finally won the war today. By the time he successfully opens that safe tomorrow morning, we are going to make absolutely sure there is nothing left inside your entire financial empire for him to steal. I will send you the first crucial set of legal directives in exactly 1 hour. Stay quiet and stay alive, Victoria. The line clicked dead. I slowly lowered the burner phone and stared blankly at the far wall of my bedroom. The crippling sense of total isolation had finally vanished completely, replaced by a cold, burning, furious focus. The legal trap was officially set. My father and my husband thought they had successfully buried me alive today, but they had simply provided me with the perfect cover to meticulously dig their graves. The afternoon sun slowly crawled across the expensive hardwood floor of my childhood bedroom, casting long dark shadows that felt entirely suffocating. I lay perfectly still on the mattress, staring at the ornate plaster ceiling, while every single minute stretched into an agonizing eternity. The heavy silence of the massive estate was broken only by the distant sound of the landscaping crew working on my father's pristine front lawn. They were manicuring the perfect facade of a wealthy family, while inside the walls, a brutal financial slaughter was being carefully orchestrated. My shattered right knee pulsed with a deep, relentless agony, but I refused to allow myself even a single tear. Crying was an absolute luxury I could no longer afford. My mind was completely consumed by the $40 million wire transfer I had successfully blocked this morning. I kept running the complex financial variables through my head, trying to understand exactly why my incredibly wealthy father would suddenly resort to such a sloppy, desperate criminal act. Richard Sterling had spent 40 years building a colossal real estate empire across the country. He was a man who legally manipulated zoning laws and municipal tax codes with terrifying precision. Stealing directly from his own daughter's venture capital firm using a forged signature was a catastrophic risk that completely defied his usual calculated methods. there was an enormous piece of this dark puzzle completely missing. The black plastic burner phone finally vibrated against my bare thigh, hidden safely beneath the thick, heavy blankets. I pulled it up instantly and accepted the encrypted call, pressing the device tightly against my ear. "Victoria, I have the entire financial picture," Marcus said, his deep voice cutting straight through the heavy static. He sounded incredibly tired, but vibrating with a cold, aggressive energy. I mobilized my entire forensic accounting team the exact second we ended our first call. We spent the last 3 hours aggressively tearing through every single public tax record, shadow corporate filing, and offshore banking registry connected to your father's holding companies. The sheer scale of his financial deception is genuinely staggering. He has spent the last decade carefully hiding a massive mountain of toxic debt behind a beautiful wall of fake equity. "Tell me everything, Marcus," I whispered, keeping my voice barely above a breath while watching the heavy bedroom door. "I need to know exactly why he tried to wire $40 million to the Cayman Islands this morning. Because he is completely out of time," Victoria, Marcus replied, his tone dropping into the clinical delivery of a seasoned prosecutor outlining a massive fraud case. The $40 million was not a strategic corporate acquisition. It was an absolutely desperate stopgap measure to prevent an immediate catastrophic collapse. Your father's entire real estate empire is nothing but a fragile house of cards, sitting directly in the middle of a massive hurricane. 2 years ago, he heavily over-leveraged his most valuable commercial properties in the downtown financial district to aggressively fund a series of luxury residential developments on the coast. But the coastal projects were a total disaster. They were hit with massive supply chain delays, severe zoning disputes, and explosive labor costs. To keep the construction moving and avoid terrifying the nervous investors, your father secretly took out massive high-interest loans from several highly unregulated private equity groups. He used the downtown commercial buildings as collateral, but the commercial real estate market crashed shortly after. The underlying value of his collateral completely evaporated. I closed my eyes tightly as the chilling financial reality washed over me. The massive Sterling family legacy was completely bankrupt. I had spent my entire adult life believing my father was a brilliant, untouchable titan of industry, but he was actually drowning in an ocean of toxic debt. "How bad is the immediate exposure?" I asked him, my voice remaining completely dead and flat. "It is completely terminal," Marcus answered bluntly. He has missed 3 consecutive quarterly payments to the private equity groups. They have officially initiated the aggressive foreclosure process on his primary corporate holdings. If he does not instantly produce $40 million in liquid cash by tomorrow morning to cover the massive penalty fees and the overdue interest, they are going to publicly seize his flagship properties. The ensuing panic will trigger a devastating chain reaction. The major national banks will immediately call in his remaining corporate loans, and he will be forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy before the end of the week. His entire public reputation, his legacy, and his vast fortune will be completely incinerated on national television. That is exactly why he absolutely needed your biometric encryption drive today. He desperately needed to drain your highly liquid venture capital funds to temporarily feed the wolves circling his own crumbling empire. The heavy fog of confusion entirely lifted, leaving behind a burning white-hot clarity. My father was not trying to protect me from the stress of my physical recovery. He was systematically cannibalizing my life's work to artificially resuscitate his own dead company. He was literally sacrificing his own daughter to save his enormous ego. But that still does not explain Preston, I said, my voice trembling slightly with a mixture of profound betrayal and growing rage. Preston has absolutely nothing to do with my father's commercial real estate business. My husband is a venture capital consultant who has spent the last 5 years living incredibly comfortably on my massive income. Why would Preston actively participate in a highly illegal medical conservatorship that directly benefits my father? What possible incentive does Preston have to completely destroy the woman he supposedly loves? Marcus let out a slow, heavy sigh that sounded incredibly loud through the small speaker. Because my brother is exactly the kind of greedy, pathetic parasite I always warned you he was Victoria. While we were auditing your father's crumbling corporate structures, my team uncovered a secondary shell company registered in Delaware just 3 weeks ago. It was quietly incorporated exactly 2 days after your devastating car crash. The sole registered managing director of that new shell company is Preston. We managed to legally breach the secure communications server of the law firm that drafted the incorporation documents. We found the internal term sheet outlining the exact criminal partnership between your husband and your father. I gripped the plastic phone so tightly, my knuckles ached. Tell me the exact terms of their deal, I demanded softly. Preston agreed to facilitate the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation and act as the legal spearhead for the medical conservatorship. Marcus explained, his voice thick with absolute disgust for his own brother. In exchange for successfully locking you inside that house and providing your father with total, unrestricted access to your venture capital firm, your father agreed to completely bypass your ironclad prenuptial agreement. Once your father successfully steals the $40 million to save his real estate empire, they are going to systematically liquidate the entire remaining balance of your corporate portfolio. The term sheet explicitly guarantees Preston a full 50% cut of all your liquidated personal and corporate assets. They are going to evenly split your entire billion-dollar empire right down the middle. The air completely vanished from my lungs. My brilliant, charming husband did not just want to steal a few $1 million. He wanted to completely erase me from the financial map. And there is one final, horrifying condition. Marcus continued, his tone growing incredibly dark and heavy. Preston is getting a massive financial payout, but he also negotiated a completely clean legal exit from your marriage. The forged psychiatric evaluation Dr. Evans signed this afternoon does not just declare you mentally unfit to manage your finances. It specifically states that your severe brain trauma has made you incredibly hostile, violent, and permanently incapable of maintaining a healthy marital relationship. Preston is going to use that exact medical document to file for an emergency expedited divorce. He gets to walk away with half of your entire life's work while playing the tragic, heartbroken husband forced to leave his severely brain-damaged wife for his own physical safety. He will be incredibly rich, entirely single, and completely shielded from any public scrutiny by your father's powerful political connections. A single tear finally escaped my right eye, completely betraying my iron control and sliding slowly down my pale cheek. They had planned absolutely everything with terrifying precision. They were going to leave me trapped in a heavily medicated mental fog, locked in a private psychiatric facility with absolutely no money, no firm, and no legal voice. They had successfully weaponized my love, my trust, and my temporary physical weakness to execute the perfect billion-dollar corporate heist. Victoria, are you still there? Marcus asked sharply, breaking through the loud ringing in my ears. I need to know that you are maintaining your composure. If they suspect for even a single second that you understand the true scope of their financial conspiracy, they will completely accelerate their timeline. I reached up and angrily wiped the tear from my face. The profound, crushing heartbreak I had felt just 5 minutes ago was entirely gone. It was instantly replaced by a cold, mechanical desire for absolute, total annihilation. They had foolishly assumed I was a weak, injured animal they could easily slaughter in the dark. They had completely forgotten that I was the most ruthless predator in the entire venture capital industry. I am still here, Marcus, I said, my voice completely steady and radiating a deadly calm authority. The wire transfer fails tomorrow morning because of the security lockout. That gives us exactly 1 night to legally move my entire portfolio far beyond their reach. Have you finished drafting the proxy documents to circumvent the conservatorship? The irrevocable living trust documents are completely finished, Marcus replied, his voice matching my cold professional intensity. I am sending the secure digital signature links to your burner phone right now. We are going to quietly transfer every single patent, every voting share, and every liquid asset you own directly into the new trust. I will act as the sole outside trustee. By the time Preston forces that safe open tomorrow, he will be holding the keys to an entirely empty kingdom. Send the documents immediately, I commanded, staring hard at the locked bedroom door. My father wants to save his legacy by destroying mine, and my husband wants to fund his bachelor lifestyle with my blood. Let them enjoy their celebration tonight, Marcus. Tomorrow, we are going to burn their entire world straight to the ground. I ended the secure call and slid the burner phone back into the hidden compartment inside my plaster cast. I leaned my head back against the soft pillows and smiled in the dark room. The time for hiding was almost over. The time for strategic justice had officially begun. The late afternoon sun surrendered to the creeping dusk, casting long, menacing shadows across the vintage floral wallpaper of my bedroom. I had spent the last hour mentally categorizing every single asset and patent I was about to transfer into the irrevocable living trust Marcus was finalizing. My mind was operating like a supercomputer, processing massive amounts of data and calculating the exact legal trajectory of my impending retaliation. The financial betrayal was a bitter pill, but it was a problem I could solve with aggressive corporate litigation and ruthless restructuring. I was entirely focused on the money because money was the language I spoke fluently. I assumed my father and my husband were simply greedy cowards who had seized a convenient opportunity when my sports car malfunctioned on the coastal highway 3 weeks ago. I thought the brutal crash was merely a tragic accident that had perfectly paved the way for their opportunistic financial heist. I was completely wrong. The truth was significantly darker and far more violent than a simple white-collar crime. The black burner phone vibrated aggressively against the bare skin of my leg, startling me out of my intense financial calculations. I quickly retrieved it from beneath the heavy down blankets and accepted the encrypted call. I expected to hear Marcus confirming the trust documents were fully executed and ready for my digital signature. Instead, the heavy silence on the line was thick with a terrifying dark gravity. Victoria Marcus said, his deep voice sounding completely different than it had just an hour ago. He no longer sounded like a ruthless corporate litigator preparing for a massive financial battle. He sounded exactly like a federal prosecutor standing over a fresh crime scene. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to remain absolutely perfectly calm. My heart instantly slammed against my bruised ribs. The cold, clinical tone of his voice triggered a primal alarm deep inside my chest. "What is wrong, Marcus?" I asked, keeping my voice to a sharp whisper while keeping my eyes firmly locked on the closed bedroom door. Did Preston discover the security lockout on the safe? Did my father find the hidden network traffic? It is not about the money, Victoria Marcus replied, slowly enunciating every single word with terrifying precision. While my financial team was setting up the Shell Trust, I asked my private investigative unit to pull the official police records from your car crash. I wanted to know exactly how the local police department had classified the mechanical failure on your vehicle because we needed to anticipate any potential insurance claims your father might try to file. The local precinct had officially closed the investigation last week, citing a catastrophic failure of the master cylinder. They claimed the brake lines on your newly serviced vehicle had simply ruptured under high pressure. I remember the crash, Marcus, I whispered, feeling a sudden cold sweat break out across my forehead as the horrific memory threatened to pull me under. I was driving down the steep winding curves of the Pacific Coast Highway, late at night. The rain was coming down in absolute sheets, making the slick pavement incredibly dangerous. When I approached the sharpest hairpin turn near the cliffs, I pressed my foot down hard on the brake pedal, but there was absolutely nothing there. The pedal went completely flat against the floorboard. There was no resistance and no pressure at all. The car just kept accelerating down the steep hill until I violently struck the concrete barrier and flipped over the embankment. The police told me it was a tragic manufacturing defect. The police lied to you, Victoria Marcus stated flatly, his voice practically vibrating with suppressed rage. Or more accurately, the local police chief, who happens to be a very close personal friend of your father, deliberately buried the actual forensic mechanic report. My private investigators bypassed the local precinct entirely and pulled the unredacted diagnostic photographs directly from the Independent State impound lot where your vehicle was taken immediately after the crash. I am looking at the high-resolution forensic photographs of your undercarriage right now. The brake lines did not rupture from high pressure. They were surgically compromised. The air completely left my lungs. The heavy silence in my childhood bedroom became entirely suffocating. What exactly do you mean they were compromised? I asked, my voice trembling uncontrollably for the very first time since I had discovered their plot. Someone used a specialized pair of heavy-duty wire cutters to make a tiny, precise incision on the primary hydraulic line. Marcus explained, his tone dark and methodical. They did not sever the line completely, because that would have left a massive visible puddle of brake fluid on the floor of your private garage, which you would have easily noticed before backing out. Instead, they created a very slow, deliberate leak. They knew exactly how much fluid you would lose over a specific distance. They intentionally calculated that your brakes would completely fail exactly when you reached the steep, treacherous curves of the coastal highway. This was not a mechanical accident, Victoria. This was a highly premeditated, incredibly calculated attempt on your life. The black phone suddenly felt like a heavy block of solid ice in my shaking hand. The financial fraud, the forged psychiatric evaluation, the offshore wire transfers, everything instantly snapped into a terrifying new context. They were not opportunistic thieves who had capitalized on a sudden tragedy. They were the architects of the tragedy itself. My own father and the man I had married had actively conspired to murder me in cold blood. When the calculated car crash failed to kill me, and I miraculously survived the brutal impact they had to quickly pivot to a secondary strategy. They could not simply try to kill me again while I was surrounded by dedicated doctors and nurses in a crowded public hospital, so my father had forcefully moved me back into this isolated family estate under the guise of providing specialized home care. They wanted you dead. Marcus continued verbalizing the exact horrific conclusion my mind had just reached. If you had died in that terrible crash, Preston would have automatically inherited your entire massive fortune as your legal surviving spouse. He would have then quietly transferred the necessary funds to your father to save the bankrupt real estate empire, and they both would have walked away completely clean. But you survived. You ruined their perfect murder plot by surviving the crash. So they hastily arranged this fraudulent medical conservatorship to steal your money legally while keeping you heavily sedated and completely trapped inside that house. A wave of absolute blinding nausea washed over me. I pressed my free hand hard against my mouth to keep from vomiting. The heavy sleeping pills my father had been forcing me to swallow every single night suddenly took on a deeply sinister new meaning. They were not just trying to keep me compliant and docile while they drained my bank accounts. They were slowly building a documented medical history of severe depression and psychological instability following a traumatic brain injury. Once Preston successfully emptied my venture capital firm and completely dissolved my entire financial portfolio, they would not just leave me in a psychiatric ward. They would eventually stage a tragic accidental overdose. They would claim the emotional trauma of the accident was simply too much for me to bear. Marcus, I am locked inside a house with two men who actively tried to kill me. I whispered, my voice cracking as the sheer magnitude of the physical danger finally crushed my composed facade. My father brings me my food and my medication every single day. Preston sleeps in the guest room just down the hall when he is not at the city penthouse. They control the security system, the front gates, and the staff. If they realize I have locked them out of my firm, they will not hesitate to finish the job they started 3 weeks ago. My survival is literally a ticking clock, and the timer is running out faster than we anticipated. You need to listen to me very closely, Victoria Marcus said, his voice projecting absolute authority and fierce, protective determination. We are no longer just executing a hostile corporate takeover. We are actively managing a hostage situation, and you are the hostage. You cannot let them see any fear in your eyes. You cannot let your behavior change even a fraction of an inch. You must continue to play the heavily medicated, completely broken woman perfectly. If you show them the brilliant, aggressive venture capitalist, they will instantly know the heavy drugs are not working, and they will escalate to physical violence. I understand, I replied, wiping a cold sweat from my brow and forcing my breathing to slow down to a steady, measured rhythm. I will sign the trust documents the exact second you send them. But we cannot just wait for Preston to open that empty safe tomorrow morning and realize the $40 million is completely gone. The moment he sees those empty accounts, he will know I outsmarted them. He will immediately alert my father, and they will come straight to this bedroom. I cannot physically run away with a shattered knee and a broken ribcage. I need a concrete extraction plan, Marcus. I need federal authorities walking through those front doors the exact moment Preston realizes he has lost the financial war. I am already handling it, Marcus assured me smoothly. The forensic evidence of the cut brake lines changes absolutely everything legally. This is no longer just a complex, white-collar dispute over a medical conservatorship. This is felony attempted murder across state lines intertwined with massive federal wire fraud. I am personally taking the unredacted police files and the offshore banking logs directly to a senior contact I have at the Federal Bureau of Investigation tonight. I am going to secure a sealed emergency warrant for their immediate arrest. We are going to let them host that ridiculous charity gala they have planned for you. We will let them gather all their wealthy, corrupt friends in one room, and we will execute the warrant in front of the entire city. The mention of the upcoming charity gala sent a sharp jolt of pure adrenaline straight through my veins. My father had spent the last week organizing a massive high society event at the estate to publicly celebrate my miraculous recovery while secretly planning to announce his total control over my empire. It was supposed to be my grand social execution. Instead, it was going to be their absolute decimation. The crushing fear that had paralyzed me just moments ago rapidly crystallized into a diamond-hard resolve. I was not just going to survive this nightmare. I was going to completely obliterate the men who had tried to bury me. I told Marcus to finalize the federal warrants, and I promised to keep playing my dangerous role flawlessly until the trap was perfectly set. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my cast, staring into the dark room with deadly anticipation. The morning sunlight bled through the sheer linen curtains of my bedroom, casting long, pale shadows across the hardwood floor. I had not slept since my encrypted phone call with Marcus. My mind was consumed by the terrifying revelation that the men walking freely around this estate had deliberately severed the hydraulic brake lines of my sports car. I was sharing a roof with my attempted murderers. But panic was a useless emotion, and fear was a luxury I could not afford right now. Today, I had to deliver the absolute greatest performance of my entire life. My father and husband had hired a deeply corrupt psychiatrist named Dr. Evans to legally validate their fraudulent medical conservatorship. I knew they were bringing him back to the estate this morning to conduct a final follow-up psychological evaluation. They needed to perfectly document my continued mental decline to ensure the local judge would officially sign over absolute control of my billion-dollar venture capital firm to Preston without further legal delays. If I appeared even slightly competent or mentally sharp this morning, they would instantly realize their heavy sedatives were not working. They would know I was completely aware of my surroundings, and the deadly threat I posed to their financial heist would force them to take immediate physical action against me. I needed to convince them that my mind was completely shattered. I needed to make them believe that the trauma of the brutal car crash, combined with the heavy daily medication, had entirely broken my spirit and destroyed my brilliant intellect. I slowly pushed my unbrushed hair into a messy, tangled knot and carefully rubbed my eyes until they were completely bloodshot and red. I let my posture physically collapse, sinking deep into the soft mattress like a hollow, empty shell. The heavy brass handle of my bedroom door finally turned and the thick wooden door swung open. My father, Richard, walked into the room first, wearing his customary tailored gray suit and projecting an aura of deep paternal concern that made my stomach physically churn. He was immediately followed by my husband, Preston, who looked effortlessly handsome in a crisp white dress shirt and dark designer trousers. Trailing closely behind them was Dr. Evans. The doctor was a short, balding man carrying a thick leather briefcase and wearing small wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a false air of gentle medical authority. I knew exactly who this man was because I had spent the early morning hours reading the background dossier Marcus had sent me. Dr. Evans was a highly unethical practitioner who had quietly lost his medical privileges at 2 major city hospitals due to severe financial misconduct. My father was undoubtedly paying him a massive sum of money from his rapidly dwindling offshore accounts to write the exact psychiatric reports required to steal my entire corporate empire. "Good morning, Victoria," Dr. Evans said smoothly, pulling a small wooden chair close to the edge of my bed. "Your father and husband asked me to stop by today just to see how you are adjusting to the new medication dosage we prescribed yesterday." I did not answer him immediately. I stared blankly at the blank white wall opposite my bed, letting my jaw hang slightly loose. I began to rock my upper body back and forth, very slowly, keeping my breathing shallow and erratic. I forcefully summoned the genuine terror I had felt last night when I learned about the cut break lines, and I channeled all of that pure raw panic directly into my physical performance. I suddenly flinched violently, throwing my hands up over my face as if the warm morning sunlight streaming through the window was physically burning my skin. "Make it stop," I whispered, my voice trembling and cracking with manufactured desperation. "Please, just make the loud noises stop. The cars are moving too fast and the glass is everywhere." I squeezed my eyes tightly shut and began to hyperventilate deliberately, forcing my chest to heave up and down in rapid, ragged gasps. Preston stepped forward and placed his warm hand gently on my shaking shoulder, playing the role of the tragic, heartbroken husband perfectly for the corrupt doctor. "It is okay, darling," Preston murmured softly, looking down at me with fake, loving eyes. "You are completely safe here in your childhood bedroom. There are no cars here." I violently shoved his hand away, shrinking back against the heavy wooden headboard and pulling the thick down comforter tightly up to my chin. "You do not understand," I cried out, letting genuine tears pool in my eyes and spill down my pale cheeks. "The numbers are all wrong, Preston. The venture capital portfolio is completely bleeding out, and the board of directors is standing in the middle of the highway, watching me crash. I need my biometric drive right now. Where is my encrypted drive? They are stealing the company while I am trapped inside this burning car." I began to frantically dig my fingernails into my own arms, scratching at the skin until it turned bright red and irritated. I purposely slurred my words, blending the memory of the accident with irrational paranoid delusions about my financial empire. I sounded exactly like a woman whose brilliant mind had been completely fractured by severe physical trauma and heavy chemical sedation. Dr. Evans quickly opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a silver pen, clicking it softly as he began taking detailed notes on his yellow legal pad. "She has been like this all morning," my father said, letting out a dramatic sigh that conveyed the burden of caring for a brain-damaged daughter. "She refuses to eat and keeps hallucinating about the board members breaking into the estate. We cannot manage her violent outbursts on our own anymore, Doctor. She is a danger to herself and is completely incapable of making rational decisions regarding her financial portfolio." I let out a loud wail and threw the pillows onto the floor. "I cannot find the encryption keys," I sobbed, covering my face with my trembling hands. "The brake pedal is flat and the bank accounts are empty." "Please, Daddy, do not let them take my company away." The use of the word daddy was a calculated move. I had not called Richard that since I was a little girl. I watched through my tear-filled fingers as my father's posture relaxed. His massive ego was soothed by my regression into childish dependency. He exchanged a highly satisfied glance with Preston. Dr. Evans leaned forward and tried to catch my darting eyes. "Victoria, please listen to my voice," the doctor said, maintaining his calm, condescending tone. "You are experiencing severe post-traumatic stress-induced psychosis, combined with corporate paranoia. Your brain has sustained massive emotional damage from the collision. You need to surrender all of your financial responsibilities to your husband and your father so you can focus on resting." I looked at Preston, my eyes wide with manufactured terror and completely raw vulnerability. "Please, Preston," I begged him, reaching out with a shaking hand to weakly grasp his shirt sleeve. "Please, just take all of it. Take the venture capital firm and take the bank accounts. I cannot do this anymore. It hurts too much to think, and the numbers are just screaming at me. Please, promise me, you will fix everything while I sleep." Preston's arrogant smile was completely microscopic, but I saw it perfectly. He patted my trembling hand, his eyes shining with greedy triumph. "I promise I will take care of everything for you, my beautiful wife," he whispered smoothly. "You just close your eyes and let the medication do its job." Dr. Evans stood up and closed his leather briefcase with a sharp snap. "The psychotic regression is absolutely undeniable, gentlemen," the corrupt doctor stated firmly, adjusting his glasses. "The heavy dosage of sedatives is working exactly as intended to keep her subdued, but her mental capacity is gone. I will finalize the emergency medical conservatorship paperwork this afternoon and submit it directly to the presiding judge. You will have full legal authority over her financial estate before the charity gala begins tonight." My father walked the doctor out, leaving Preston alone with me. Preston leaned down and kissed my forehead. "Rest well, Victoria," he whispered coldly before turning and walking away. The heavy door clicked shut and the deadbolt slid into place, locking me inside. I listened to their fading footsteps in the hallway. I instantly dropped the trembling, pathetic victim act, wiping the tears from my pale cheeks. My face returned to a mask of deadly cold calculation. I reached down into the hidden compartment of my cast and pulled out the black burner phone once again. The bright screen illuminated the dark room with a new encrypted message from Marcus. He confirmed the final irrevocable living trust documents were fully prepared and awaiting my digital signature. The trap was perfectly set. The heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place felt exactly like a starting gun firing in my mind. I lay perfectly still on the mattress for exactly 10 minutes, waiting for the sound of my father's and my husband's footsteps to completely fade down the long carpeted hallway of the massive estate. My heart was still hammering violently against my bruised ribs from the intense physical exertion of my fabricated panic attack. The heavy sedatives I had been pretending to swallow for 3 weeks were supposed to make me a compliant, weak, and highly suggestible victim, but my mind was actually operating with the lethal precision of a corporate predator backed into a dark corner. I reached deep into the hidden waterproof compartment of my fiberglass cast and carefully pulled out the black plastic burner phone. The small screen glowed brightly in the dim, muted light of my childhood bedroom. Marcus had sent the secure encrypted link exactly as he promised he would. I tapped the blue text on the screen and a complex biometric authentication portal appeared immediately, requiring my retinal scan and a secondary alphanumeric passcode that only I knew. I held the phone up to my right eye and rapidly typed in the complex sequence of numbers and letters. The screen flashed a brilliant green, and the master legal dashboard loaded, instantly displaying the weapon that would save my life. I was looking at the absolute total destruction of my father's real estate empire and my husband's parasitic future, perfectly formatted into 85 pages of dense, highly technical legal text. Marcus was an incredibly brilliant African-American corporate litigator who understood perfectly that true power in modern America did not come from loud public arguments or physical intimidation. True power came exclusively from ironclad contracts and perfectly executed financial structures that no judge could ever untangle. He had drafted an absolute masterpiece of corporate defense. The document glowing on my small screen was an irrevocable living trust. This was the ultimate financial fortress, the nuclear option of asset protection. Unlike a standard revocable trust, which I could easily alter or dissolve at any time, an irrevocable trust required me to permanently and legally surrender direct ownership of my massive assets to the trust itself. By legally transferring my entire billion-dollar venture capital portfolio into this highly specific legal vehicle, I was entirely removing the assets from my personal estate and completely erasing my name from the ownership titles. Because the assets would no longer technically belong to Victoria Sterling, they could never be legally controlled by whoever held my medical conservatorship. The corrupt psychiatric evaluation Dr. Evans had just happily signed for my father was completely useless if there was absolutely no money left in my personal name to control. I scrolled slowly through the massive digital ledger Marcus had meticulously prepared for my review. The first major section detailed the immediate transfer of my controlling voting shares in the venture capital firm. I had spent 15 brutal, exhausting years building that company from a tiny leased office suite above a dry cleaner into a global financial powerhouse that dictated market trends. I had sacrificed my entire 20s sitting in endless hostile board meetings and ruthlessly negotiating with the most aggressive corporate sharks in Silicon Valley. Preston genuinely thought he could simply steal my life's work by bribing a disgraced doctor and putting on a sad, concerned face for a local county judge. I tapped the screen and officially executed the quitclaim deed, transferring all 70% of my voting shares directly into the trust. The second section contained the highly classified intellectual property of my firm. This included the highly proprietary predictive algorithms my analysts used to identify wildly profitable tech startups before they ever went public. Preston had desperately wanted my biometric thumb drive this morning, specifically to access these exact algorithms. He fully intended to sell them to my biggest corporate rivals for a massive personal payout before completely dissolving my company. I transferred every single medical patent, every complex line of code, and every digital trademark into the airtight legal vault of the trust. They were now completely untouchable by anyone outside of the designated legal arrangement. The third section of the heavy legal document addressed my extensive premarital assets. These were the highly valuable luxury properties and the private offshore banking accounts I had built long before I ever made the catastrophic mistake of meeting Preston. This extensive list included the $20 million penthouse overlooking the city skyline where Preston was currently living his luxurious bachelor lifestyle while I was trapped in this room. It included the massive, priceless art collection my late mother had carefully curated over 3 decades, and the vintage European vehicles sitting securely in my private, climate-controlled garage downtown. I digitally signed over the title to every single property, effectively and legally evicting my own husband from his home, without him even realizing it yet. The absolute most beautiful part of this entire legal strategy was the specific designation of the trustee. To make the irrevocable trust legally binding and functionally bulletproof against any aggressive future lawsuits, I needed to officially appoint a trustee to manage the massive assets on my behalf. I scrolled down to the final signature line and saw the name Marcus Hayes printed boldly in black text. By naming Marcus as the sole co-trustee, I was legally granting him absolute, unmitigated fiduciary control over my entire financial empire. If Preston walked into my firm tomorrow morning, waving his fraudulent medical conservatorship papers and aggressively demanding access to the corporate bank accounts, the branch manager would simply laugh in his face. Preston would be legally informed that Victoria Sterling was entirely bankrupt and that a ruthless federal litigator named Marcus Hayes now controlled the entire billion-dollar portfolio. Suddenly, I heard the distinct, heavy tread of expensive leather shoes walking slowly back up the main wooden staircase. My blood ran instantly cold, turning to ice in my veins. I quickly dimmed the brightness on the burner phone to 0 and slid it firmly beneath my heavy plaster cast, pressing my cheek flat against the damp pillow. I closed my eyes tightly, leaving only a tiny microscopic slit open to watch the heavy oak door. The deliberate footsteps stopped directly outside my bedroom. I instantly recognized the arrogant, confident weight of Preston's stance. He was standing right on the other side of the door, separated from me by only 2 inches of solid wood. I held my breath, forcing my chest to remain completely still, despite the agonizing sharp pain in my shattered ribs. The brass handle did not turn, but I could feel his dark presence practically radiating through the doorframe. He was actively listening. He was waiting quietly to see if my hysterical, fabricated breakdown had finally exhausted me, and if the heavy sedatives had successfully pulled me into a deep, unconscious sleep. I lay there, perfectly still in the suffocating silence, mentally daring him to open the door and walk inside. I desperately wanted him to walk in and see the cold, calculated murder burning in my eyes, but he simply let out a low, highly satisfied chuckle that made my skin physically crawl, and he slowly walked away toward the luxurious guest suite down the long hall. The sound of his bedroom door closing echoed loudly through the empty hallway, signaling that the immediate physical threat had passed. I pulled the black phone back out from under my leg and wiped a heavy bead of cold sweat from my forehead. The sheer unbelievable audacity of his satisfied laugh fueled a burning white-hot rage deep inside my chest. He actually thought he had completely won the war. He genuinely thought his handsome face and his manufactured superficial charm had successfully conquered a woman who routinely destroyed arrogant, wealthy men for a living. I returned my intense focus entirely to the glowing screen in my hands. There was one final brilliant legal mechanism Marcus had cleverly embedded into the very bottom of the trust agreement. It was a preemptive, absolute nullification clause regarding any legal documents signed under extreme duress or documented medical incapacitation. By finalizing this trust right now, at this exact digital timestamp, I was creating an absolute legal baseline that could never be erased. Any corporate contract, any offshore wire transfer, any banking authorization Preston violently forced me to sign later this afternoon or tomorrow morning would hold absolutely zero legal weight in any federal or state court in the country. He could literally drag me out of this bed, drag me to a corrupt notary public, and physically force a pen into my trembling hand, but the ink on the paper would be entirely worthless. My signature was now legally dead, and it could never be resurrected to serve his greedy purposes. The final digital signature pad appeared on the small glowing screen, waiting for my command. I used my right index finger to carefully trace my name across the smooth glass surface. The letters were perfectly steady and elegantly formed, completely devoid of the weak, trembling hesitation I had deliberately displayed for the corrupt Dr. Evans just an hour ago. I hit the final green submit button at the bottom of the screen. The entire display flashed a brilliant bright blue, confirming that the encrypted data packets were successfully transmitting to the highly secure server at Marcus's downtown law firm. A small white loading bar appeared tracking the massive, unprecedented transfer of wealth and corporate power across state lines and federal jurisdictions. I watched the percentage climb slowly upwards. 10%, 30%, 50%. With every single digital digit that clicked upward, my corrupt father was losing another desperate financial lifeline for his bankrupt commercial real estate empire. With every passing second, my treacherous husband was losing another $1 million of the luxurious, carefree future he thought he had successfully stolen from me. The white loading bar finally hit 100%, and a crisp green checkmark appeared on the screen, accompanied by a highly satisfying digital confirmation code that meant the transfer was permanently locked in stone. The deed was officially done, and the legal trap was perfectly set. In less than 30 minutes, sitting completely alone in a locked childhood bedroom with a shattered knee and a broken ribcage, I had completely dismantled a highly coordinated billionaire heist. My entire life's work, my mother's beautiful legacy, and my massive corporate empire were now safely locked inside an impenetrable legal fortress, heavily guarded by the most aggressive corporate litigator in America. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the crushing, suffocating weight of the last 3 horrific weeks finally begin to lift from my tired shoulders. The fraudulent medical conservatorship they had worked so hard to secure was now absolutely nothing but a worthless piece of paper controlling a financial ghost. My father and my husband had spent thousands of dollars and happily committed numerous federal felonies just to lock me inside this house. They had violently cut the brake lines on my sports car and eagerly waited for me to die on the side of a wet highway. When that failed, they had hired a disgraced doctor to declare me clinically insane. They had even planned a lavish high society charity gala for tonight to publicly celebrate my tragic medical downfall and proudly announce their hostile takeover of my company to the entire city. They had meticulously arranged every single detail of my destruction, but they had completely forgotten the most fundamental rule of the venture capital industry that I had learned on my very first day. You never, ever celebrate closing the massive deal until the money is actually sitting securely in the bank. I slid the burner phone back into the waterproof compartment hidden deep inside my thick fiberglass cast and snapped the plastic latch securely shut, making sure it was completely invisible. I pulled the heavy down comforter up to my chin and stared at the ornate plaster ceiling with a cold, deadly smile spreading slowly across my face. Let them enjoy their quiet, victorious afternoon. Let Preston happily pick out his favorite custom-tailored tuxedo for the charity gala tonight. Let my corrupt father practice his heartfelt, emotional speech about his deeply injured, tragic daughter. Tonight I was going to walk out of this locked bedroom and completely burn their entire arrogant world straight to the ground. The late afternoon sun had completely vanished behind the dense tree line of the estate, leaving my bedroom bathed in a cool gray twilight. I had spent the last 2 hours lying perfectly still in the quiet darkness, conserving every single ounce of my physical and mental energy. The encrypted living trust was securely locked in the downtown servers of Marcus Hayes, and my financial empire was now completely untouchable. But my physical body was still trapped inside this massive house with 2 men who wanted me dead. I listened closely to the ambient sounds of the estate. Downstairs, I could hear the faint muffled noises of heavy furniture being moved across the marble floors of the grand ballroom. I heard the sharp clinking of crystal glasses and the distant shouting of catering directors giving urgent orders to their waitstaff. My father was clearly sparing absolutely no expense for the elaborate social trap he was aggressively building. He was actively using the last remaining drops of his highly leveraged credit to fund a spectacular illusion of immense wealth and total control. The heavy brass deadbolt on my bedroom door suddenly clicked loudly, echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. The thick wooden door swung open, and the warm golden light from the hallway spilled across my bed. My father, Richard, and my husband, Preston, walked into the room together. They looked exactly like 2 victorious generals returning from a highly successful military campaign. They had both changed into custom-tailored evening wear. My father wore a classic black tuxedo that perfectly masked his impending financial ruin, while Preston wore a sharp midnight blue dinner jacket that highlighted his arrogant youthful charm. I instantly let my facial muscles go completely slack and forced my eyes to glaze over, adopting the exact same vacant, highly medicated stare I had perfected earlier this morning. My father walked straight to the edge of my mattress and looked down at me with a sickeningly warm, paternal smile. "Victoria, sweetheart," he murmured softly, his voice dripping with a fake honeyed affection that made my skin crawl. "You are looking so much calmer this evening. Dr. Evans was absolutely right about increasing your dosage because you finally seem to be resting peacefully." I offered him a weak, hollow smile, letting my head loll slightly to the side against the thick pillows. "I feel very tired, Dad," I whispered, making sure to slur my words just enough to be entirely convincing. My head is extremely heavy, but the terrible screaming numbers have finally stopped. Preston stepped forward and gently brushed a stray lock of hair away from my forehead. His touch was cold and clinical, but his handsome face was arranged into a mask of deep, loving concern. "We are so incredibly relieved to hear that," darling Preston said smoothly. "You gave us quite a terrifying scare this morning with your severe panic attack, but we have some very exciting news that we think will cheer you up and help you transition into this peaceful new chapter of your life. Your father and I have been working tirelessly all afternoon to organize a beautiful surprise for you." I blinked slowly, staring up at him with wide, empty eyes. "A surprise?" I asked softly, letting a note of childish confusion slip into my tone. My father smoothly took over the conversation, stepping closer to the bed. "The entire city has been absolutely worried sick about you since the tragic car accident, Victoria. Your corporate board members, the local politicians, and all of our close family friends have been constantly calling the estate, begging for updates on your physical condition. We simply cannot keep hiding you away in this room forever. So tonight, we are hosting a magnificent high society charity gala right here in the Grand Ballroom. We have invited 400 of the most influential people in the state to personally celebrate your miraculous physical recovery. We want everyone to see that you are safely back home and surrounded by the people who love you most." I kept my expression entirely blank, but inside my chest, my heart gave a massive, violent leap. This was the exact event Marcus and I had heavily anticipated. This was the grand stage they had built to publicly execute my professional reputation and steal my entire life's work. Preston sat carefully on the edge of the mattress, leaning in close so I could smell the expensive cologne he had undoubtedly purchased using my credit card. "It is going to be a truly magical evening, Victoria," he whispered confidently. "But we also need to use this beautiful gathering to formally address the future of your venture capital firm. The financial markets hate uncertainty, darling, and the rumors about your severe mental decline are beginning to negatively affect the stock prices of your primary portfolio companies. Tonight, your father and I are going to step up to the main podium and officially announce that you are permanently stepping down as the managing partner of the firm. We are going to tell the entire world that you are officially passing the corporate torch to me, so you can focus entirely on your long-term medical rehabilitation." The sheer breathtaking audacity of his plan hung heavily in the quiet air of the bedroom. He was not just stealing my billion-dollar company behind closed doors. He wanted me to physically sit in a room full of my peers, my mentors, and my ruthless competitors, and silently nod along while he publicly stripped me of my power, my dignity, and my massive fortune. He wanted the absolute validation of the high society elite. "But I cannot walk down those stairs, Preston," I whimpered pitifully, gesturing weakly toward my heavy fiberglass cast. "My leg is completely shattered, and I am far too exhausted to speak to all those important people. Please do not make me go down there." My father reached out and patted my hand reassuringly. "You do not have to say a single word tonight, sweetheart," he promised smoothly. "We have already arranged for a medical transport chair to bring you down to the main ballroom just before the final toast. All you have to do is sit beside Preston at the head table, look incredibly beautiful, and offer the crowd a brave, happy smile when he makes the official transition announcement. Preston will handle the heavy speech, and I will personally manage the wealthy investors. We just need your silent physical presence to prove to the corporate board that you are willingly surrendering your voting shares. Once the short announcement is over, we will bring you right back up to this quiet room so you can sleep." I looked back and forth between the two men who had violently cut the brake lines on my sports car and eagerly planned my brutal demise. They were practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. They genuinely believed they had flawlessly executed the greatest financial crime of the decade. They thought they had successfully broken the most aggressive venture capitalist in the country, reducing her to a compliant nodding puppet for their extravagant charity gala. They needed my public submission to legally validate the fraudulent conservatorship and finalize their massive theft. I lowered my eyes to the heavy blankets and let out a long, pathetic sigh of total defeat. "Okay," I whispered softly, and my voice trembling with perfectly manufactured resignation. "If you and Dr. Evans truly think stepping down is the best thing for my health, then I will do it. I will come downstairs tonight and smile for your big announcement, Preston. I just want all of this overwhelming stress to finally be over." Preston beamed with absolute triumph. His arrogant smile stretched wide across his handsome face, completely unable to hide his massive, greedy satisfaction. "You are making the absolute smartest choice of your entire life, Victoria," he said, leaning down to press a hard, victorious kiss against my cheek. "I promise you that by tomorrow morning, you will not have a single financial worry left in the world. I will take complete control of everything, and you can finally just rest." The profound, terrifying irony of his statement echoed loudly in my mind. He was absolutely right about one thing. By tomorrow morning, I would not have a single financial worry left in the world, because his entire criminal world was going to be completely eradicated by the federal government. "We will send your personal styling team up in exactly 1 hour to help you get dressed for the evening," my father said, checking his heavy gold wristwatch. "Wear the vintage emerald necklace your mother gave you, sweetheart. We want you to look like absolute royalty tonight when you officially hand over the keys to the kingdom. We will come back to escort you downstairs when the ballroom is completely full." The two men turned and walked confidently out of the bedroom, leaving the door unlocked for the very first time in 3 weeks. They no longer needed to lock me inside because they truly believed my spirit was completely broken and my mind was entirely subdued by their heavy chemical restraints. They thought the war was already won. I listened to their heavy footsteps fade down the hallway as they marched downstairs to greet their wealthy, corrupt guests and finalize the details of their grand corporate theft. The exact second they were gone, I dropped the weak, pathetic smile and sat completely upright on the soft mattress, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain in my broken ribs. A cold, deadly energy flooded my entire body completely, washing away the physical exhaustion. I had successfully survived the brutal car crash, I had survived their heavy, toxic sedatives, and I had survived 3 weeks of absolute suffocating psychological torture in this dark room. Tonight, I was finally going to unleash the devastating consequences of their monumental arrogance. They had aggressively demanded a public execution, and I was more than happy to oblige them. They wanted to gather 400 of the most powerful, influential people in the state into one massive room to witness my total destruction. They were proudly setting the stage, adjusting the bright lights, and pouring the expensive champagne, completely unaware that they were actually building their own grand funeral pyre. When I finally rolled my wheelchair into that crowded ballroom tonight, I would not be the tragic, broken wife stepping down from her throne. I would be the absolute architect of their total annihilation. I reached down and lightly touched the hidden compartment of my cast, where the black burner phone rested safely inside. Marcus Hayes had the irrevocable living trust documents and the sealed federal warrants firmly in his hands. He was already moving quietly toward the estate, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I leaned my head back against the thick wooden headboard and smiled into the empty room. The gala invitation was officially accepted. The trap was perfectly set. Now all I had to do was put on a beautiful dress, wear my mother's vintage emeralds, and politely wait for the federal agents to violently kick down the front doors. The distant sound of a string quartet warming up drifted softly through my open window, carried by the cool evening breeze. The musicians were likely setting up on the grand marble terrace, playing elegant classical music to perfectly mask the grotesque criminal conspiracy unfolding directly beneath their feet. I could easily picture the caterers arranging massive silver platters of expensive caviar and pouring endless bottles of vintage French champagne. My father was undoubtedly shaking hands with the corrupt city officials and the greedy private equity bankers who were patiently waiting for their massive illegal payouts tomorrow morning. They were all standing in my childhood home, actively drinking my expensive wine and eagerly anticipating the complete dissolution of my massive financial empire. I slowly swung my heavy fiberglass cast over the side of the mattress, placing my bare left foot firmly on the cold hardwood floor. Every single muscle in my battered body screamed in loud protest, but I forcefully pushed the physical pain deep down into a dark, mental box. The time for resting was completely over. I carefully pulled myself up to a standing position, heavily leaning my weight against the solid wooden nightstand. I caught a brief glimpse of my reflection in the tall, antique mirror across the room. I looked incredibly pale, terrifyingly thin and physically fragile, but my dark eyes were burning with a fierce, cold white fire that absolutely nothing could extinguish. Preston and my father had spent the last 3 weeks looking directly at my face, but they had never actually seen the dangerous woman hiding quietly behind my eyes. They had fatally underestimated my profound resilience. They had foolishly assumed that because I was a woman who had deeply loved her husband and respected her powerful father, I would simply crumble into dust when they suddenly betrayed me. They did not understand that the massive billion-dollar venture capital firm I had built from nothing was not just a successful business. It was my armor. It was the sharp, heavy sword I used to conquer a deeply hostile corporate world. They had tried to violently strip that armor away from me while I was bleeding on the side of a wet highway. But instead of killing me, they had simply forced me to forge an entirely new weapon. A weapon made of pure, unbreakable strategic justice. The styling team would be arriving in less than an hour to carefully paint my face and dress me in expensive silk for the grand performance. I would let them cover my dark bruises with heavy, expensive makeup. I would let them pin my messy hair into an elegant, flawless style. I would wear the heavy, vintage emerald necklace my mother had left me, proudly displaying the true, legitimate legacy of the Sterling family name. I would let them wheel me down into the bright, crowded ballroom, and I would sit perfectly still while my husband arrogantly claimed everything I had ever worked for. I would gladly give him his few precious minutes of absolute unearned glory, because I knew exactly what was coming next. The moment Preston confidently raised his crystal glass to finalize the hostile takeover, I was going to completely shatter his entire arrogant reality. The federal warrants were signed, the offshore accounts were legally neutralized, and the massive living trust was completely sealed. The stage was perfectly set for the greatest public decimation this city had ever witnessed. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cold, deadly calm entirely consume my mind. I was completely ready for the gala. The grand ballroom of the Sterling family estate was a masterclass in inherited wealth and architectural intimidation. The massive space had been completely transformed for the evening, featuring towering floral arrangements of white orchids and hundreds of floating silk candles that cast a warm golden glow over the expensive imported marble floors. A 12-piece string quartet played a flawless classical arrangement in the corner, providing the perfect, elegant soundtrack for the massive financial slaughter my father had carefully orchestrated. 400 of the most powerful and influential people in the state were currently mingling beneath the antique crystal chandeliers, drinking vintage champagne from delicate glass flutes, and exchanging quiet rumors about my tragic mental decline. I stood at the very top of the grand sweeping staircase, hidden completely in the dark shadows of the second-floor balcony, looking down at the glittering crowd of corporate vultures. My father had curated this guest list with absolute clinical precision. I recognized the wealthy private equity bankers who were patiently waiting to carve up my venture capital firm tomorrow morning. I saw the highly compromised local politicians whose re-election campaigns were heavily funded by my father's dark money holding companies. I even spotted the honorable county judge standing near the lavish caviar station, laughing warmly with Dr. Evans. That was the exact same judge who was scheduled to formally approve my fraudulent medical conservatorship first thing tomorrow morning. The entire room was a suffocating ecosystem of absolute corruption and blind greed. They had all gathered here tonight in their expensive designer tuxedos and custom silk gowns to politely drink my wine and happily witness my total professional execution. But they were expecting a heavily medicated, shattered woman to be wheeled out in a medical transport chair. They were expecting a tragic, broken victim who would silently nod her head and cry weak, grateful tears while her handsome husband generously took over her massive financial empire. They were absolutely not expecting the woman standing at the top of the stairs right now. When the private styling team had arrived at my bedroom exactly 1 hour ago, I had immediately dismissed the expensive medical transport chair my father had arrogantly provided. I refused to let my final public victory be delivered from a seated position of manufactured weakness. Instead, I had ordered the frightened stylist to tightly bind my shattered ribs with professional athletic tape, perfectly concealing the heavy bruising under my clothes. I had instructed them to carefully cut the bulky plaster away from my right foot, just enough to allow me to wear a single black velvet designer flat, while my left foot wore a devastatingly sharp 4-inch stiletto heel. To support my broken knee, I was gripping a sleek custom-forged black carbon fiber walking cane that looked much more like a lethal weapon than a simple mobility aid. I had completely shed the pathetic, sickly daughter aesthetic my father had forced upon me for 3 agonizing weeks. I was wearing a stunning floor-length gown made of heavy midnight blue silk that draped perfectly across my frame, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable authority. The deep, rich color of the dress made my pale skin look like flawless porcelain, and the severe, asymmetrical cut highlighted the sharp, calculating angles of my face. My dark hair was pulled back into an incredibly tight, sleek twist that exposed the bare, elegant line of my neck, and resting heavily against my collarbone was the legendary Sterling family heirloom. It was a massive 20-carat vintage emerald necklace surrounded by flawless white diamonds that my late mother had specifically left to me. The brilliant green stones caught the dim light of the hallway and practically burned with a cold, fierce fire. I did not look like a woman who was losing her mind. I looked exactly like a ruthless corporate queen stepping directly onto a bloody battlefield to effortlessly slaughter her enemies. I gripped the smooth carbon fiber handle of my cane and took my very first step out of the dark shadows and into the bright golden light at the top of the grand staircase. The intense physical pain shooting up from my shattered right knee was absolutely blinding, but I forcefully swallowed it down, refusing to let even a single micro-expression of discomfort cross my perfectly painted face. I took another slow, deliberate step, and the sharp click of my single stiletto heel echoed loudly over the classical music playing below. A wealthy socialite standing near the bottom of the stairs happened to look up, and she immediately froze completely, dropping her crystal champagne flute right onto the marble floor. The sharp sound of the shattering glass caused a sudden ripple of attention to spread rapidly through the massive room. One by one, the 400 elite guests stopped talking and turned their heads to look up at the grand staircase. The elegant string quartet slowly faltered and entirely stopped playing as the musicians stared at me in total shock. Within 15 seconds, the massive, bustling ballroom was plunged into an absolute dead, deafening silence. I began my slow, highly calculated descent down the heavy wooden steps. I kept my posture completely rigid, and my chin held impossibly high, projecting an overwhelming wave of cold, intimidating power that washed directly over the silent crowd. I stared straight ahead, making deliberate, piercing eye contact with the corrupt judges and the greedy investors who were actively plotting to steal my life's work. They physically shrank back under my dark, heavy gaze, shifting nervously in their expensive suits and suddenly looking everywhere except at my face. They had all been told by my father that I was a hysterical, heavily sedated mental patient who was suffering from severe post-traumatic psychosis. But the woman walking slowly down those stairs, radiating absolute deadly calm and wearing millions of dollars in vintage diamonds, completely shattered their comfortable criminal illusion. The entire narrative my father had carefully built over the last 3 weeks was instantly crumbling right in front of their eyes. I reached the grand landing halfway down the staircase and paused for a brief moment, resting my weight heavily on the black carbon fiber cane. I scanned the massive crowd until I finally located my father and my husband standing near the main podium at the front of the ballroom. The absolute sheer terror radiating from their sudden rigid posture was incredibly delicious to witness. My father, Richard, had gone entirely pale, his face turning the exact color of dirty chalk. His expensive crystal glass was shaking violently in his right hand, directly betraying the massive panic, rapidly flooding his corrupt nervous system. He stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes, instantly realizing that the heavy sedatives he thought he had been successfully forcing down my throat had completely failed. He knew exactly what this confident, powerful display meant. It meant I was entirely awake and perfectly aware of his massive financial betrayal. Beside him, Preston looked exactly like a man who had just stepped directly onto a hidden landmine. His handsome, arrogant face was completely frozen in a mask of absolute horror. He had spent the entire afternoon bragging to the wealthy guests about his impending corporate promotion and happily accepting their premature congratulations. He had confidently expected to wheel a drooling compliant victim up to the microphone tonight. Seeing me stand tall and utterly magnificent in my dark silk gown entirely destroyed his perfect narcissistic fantasy. I saw his jaw clench furiously as he quickly realized his easy path to a massive billion-dollar payday was suddenly heavily barricaded. But despite their profound internal panic, they were completely trapped by their own elaborate social performance. They had invited 400 of the most powerful people in the state to this grand charity gala to publicly celebrate my miraculous recovery and announce my peaceful transition of power. If they suddenly tried to physically stop me or drag me back upstairs right now, they would instantly expose their entire criminal conspiracy to the very judges and politicians they needed to legally validate the medical conservatorship tomorrow. Their monumental arrogance had securely backed them into an impossible corner. They had absolutely no choice but to awkwardly proceed with their deadly plan and pray that my powerful appearance was just a temporary adrenaline-fueled facade. I resumed my slow descent, finally reaching the bottom of the grand staircase and stepping smoothly onto the polished marble floor of the ballroom. The massive crowd of wealthy guests immediately parted like the Red Sea, frantically scrambling out of my way to create a wide, clear path leading directly to the front of the room. I walked with slow, measured precision, using the black cane to support my shattered knee while keeping my movements flawlessly elegant and completely controlled. The heavy silence in the room was entirely suffocating, broken only by the sharp rhythmic click of my stiletto heel and the soft rustle of my heavy midnight blue silk gown. I did not smile, and I did not acknowledge the nervous, scattered applause that a few confused guests weakly attempted to offer. I was a predator, slowly stalking through a highly populated jungle, keeping my dark eyes entirely locked on my two primary targets. I finally reached the long, lavishly decorated head table, positioned right next to the grand speaking podium. Preston practically leaped forward, his face rapidly cycling through the extreme panic and desperate manufactured affection. He reached out his hands, offering to help me into the plush velvet chair reserved for the guest of honor. "Victoria, darling, you look absolutely breathtaking," he whispered fiercely through a tight, forced smile, his voice strained and completely breathless. "We were expecting you to use the medical transport chair. You really should not be pushing your physical limits like this tonight." I stopped completely and turned my head slowly to look directly into his terrified eyes. I did not whisper back, and I did not lower my voice. I spoke with a clear, cold, ringing authority that easily carried across the absolute silence of the front rows. I find that a wheelchair significantly limits my ability to oversee my corporate investments. "Preston," I said smoothly, my tone dripping with pure polished ice. "And since we have so many important financial transitions to announce tonight, I absolutely needed to be standing firmly on my own 2 feet. Preston's fake smile shattered completely, breaking into 1,000 tiny pieces of pure dread. My father quickly stepped up beside him, desperately trying to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation by placing a heavy warning hand on my shoulder. "You are putting on a very brave face for our lovely guest, sweetheart," my father said, his voice laced with a dark, hidden threat. "But we both know you are still incredibly fragile. Please, just sit down and let your husband handle the heavy lifting tonight, exactly as we discussed upstairs." I calmly reached up and firmly removed his hand from my shoulder, brushing the expensive fabric of my silk gown as if his touch had physically soiled it. I gracefully lowered myself into the plush velvet chair, placing my black carbon fiber cane carefully across my lap. I folded my hands, perfectly resting them on the crisp white tablecloth, and looked up at the two men who had violently tried to murder me. "I am sitting, Richard," I replied coldly, deliberately, refusing to call him Dad in front of the massive crowd. "Now please do exactly what you promised everyone you would do tonight. Let the grand show finally begin." My father swallowed hard, his prominent Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight silk bow tie. He exchanged a desperate, terrified glance with Preston. They both knew the ground was rapidly shifting completely beneath their feet, but they had passed the point of no return. Preston slowly turned away from me and walked heavily toward the wooden podium, his usual charismatic swagger entirely replaced by a stiff, fearful march. He adjusted the main microphone, tapping it twice, as the loud rhythmic thud echoed through the silent ballroom. He was about to confidently deliver the exact speech he thought would successfully steal my entire venture capital firm. And I was simply sitting comfortably in my velvet chair, waiting patiently for Marcus Hayes to kick down the front doors with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Preston stood frozen behind the heavy mahogany podium for a long, agonizing moment, staring out at the sea of wealthy investors and powerful politicians. The bright stage lights illuminated the fine beads of cold sweat rapidly forming along his hairline. He gripped the edges of the wooden stand so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. The Grand Charity Gala was supposed to be his triumphant coronation, but my unexpected presence in the midnight blue silk gown had completely shattered his carefully scripted reality. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward my father, who was standing entirely rigid near the front table. Richard gave him a sharp, imperceptible nod. It was a silent, desperate command to aggressively push forward with their original plan because they were entirely trapped by the massive audience they had invited. Preston slowly leaned toward the microphone and forced his facial muscles to relax into the charismatic, deeply concerned expression he had flawlessly perfected over our 5-year marriage. "Good evening, everyone." Preston began, his voice echoing loudly through the silent ballroom. His tone was incredibly smooth and completely saturated with a fake, heavy sorrow. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight to support the Sterling family during what has undoubtedly been the most challenging period of our lives. As you can see, my beautiful wife Victoria has joined us this evening." He gestured gracefully toward where I sat perfectly upright in my plush velvet chair. Please join me in acknowledging her profound bravery for simply walking down those stairs tonight, because every single step she takes is a monumental medical victory. A scattered, hesitant round of applause rippled through the massive room. The wealthy guests clapped politely, but their eyes remained completely fixed on my sharp, unyielding posture. I did not nod, and I did not smile. I simply stared directly into Preston's lying eyes, projecting an aura of absolute freezing contempt. 3 weeks ago, Preston continued lowering his voice to a dramatic, intimate register that demanded absolute attention from the crowd. 3 weeks ago, I received the phone call that every husband absolutely dreads. I was told that Victoria had been involved in a catastrophic car crash on the coastal highway. They told me her vehicle had violently rolled down a steep embankment and that I needed to rush to the hospital to say my final goodbyes. The doctors warned me that even if she miraculously survived the physical trauma, the severe neurological damage from the impact would completely alter the brilliant woman I loved. I sat perfectly still, listening to the man who had deliberately ordered someone to cut my hydraulic brake lines publicly play the role of the deeply traumatized spouse. His performance was genuinely spectacular. He paused perfectly, allowing a heavy, dramatic silence to fill the grand ballroom while he slowly wiped a fake tear from the corner of his eye. The sheer psychopathic audacity of his lies would have entirely broken me just 24 hours ago, but tonight, they only fueled the cold burning fire in my chest. I knew that Marcus Hayes was currently standing just a few miles away, holding the sealed federal warrants that would completely destroy this elegant illusion. We brought Victoria back to her childhood estate because we believed the familiar surroundings would help heal her shattered mind, Preston said, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. Her father and I have spent every waking moment of the last 3 weeks closely monitoring her recovery, working with the top psychiatric specialists in the state. And while her physical body is slowly healing exactly as you can see tonight, the invisible wounds to her brilliant mind have proven to be devastatingly permanent. The severe post-traumatic stress and the complex cognitive decline have completely stripped her of the ability to manage the massive stress of her daily life. The highly potent sedatives required simply to keep her terrible night terrors at bay have unfortunately rendered her entirely incapable of processing complex financial data. A low collective murmur swept through the rows of custom-tailored tuxedos and expensive designer gowns. The greedy private equity bankers leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. They did not care about my supposed brain injury. They only cared about the billions of dollars in liquid assets that were suddenly vulnerable and unprotected. They had smelled blood in the water for weeks, and now Preston was loudly ringing the dinner bell. As you all know, Victoria built one of the most successful venture capital firms in the country, Preston announced proudly, adopting the authoritative tone of a seasoned corporate executive. She was a ruthless visionary who entirely reshaped the technology investment landscape. But the global financial markets absolutely despise uncertainty. Over the last 3 weeks, the rumors regarding her declining mental health have caused severe panic among our primary shareholders. Our major funding rounds are stalling, and our board of directors is legally demanding immediate stable leadership to protect our massive portfolio. We simply cannot allow the beautiful legacy Victoria spent 15 years building to completely collapse because of a tragic medical accident. Preston stood taller behind the podium, his chest puffing out slightly as he finally reached the core objective of his grand speech. He was masterfully blending my fake personal tragedy with urgent corporate necessity. He was giving every corrupt politician and greedy investor in the room the exact moral justification they needed to happily look the other way while he stole my entire empire. He was painting himself as a reluctant savior, bravely stepping into the chaotic breach to rescue a failing mind and a falling company. That is exactly why Richard and I have made a profoundly difficult but absolutely necessary family decision tonight. Preston declared, his voice ringing with fake heroic resolve. Following the strict medical guidance of her psychiatric team, we are officially executing a full medical conservatorship to protect Victoria's vast financial interests. Effective immediately, Victoria is permanently stepping down as the managing partner of her firm. I will be fully assuming the role of Chief Executive Officer, and Richard will be joining the executive board as a senior strategic advisor. I am completely setting aside my own private consulting career to dedicate my life to managing her portfolio and ensuring her investors are fully protected. My father, Richard, finally forced himself to step forward from the shadows, moving to stand proudly right beside the podium. He placed a heavy, supportive hand on Preston's shoulder, looking out at the massive crowd with the solemn dignity of a grieving but resolute patriarch. It was a beautiful, touching display of male solidarity and absolute corporate theft. They were publicly declaring their hostile takeover and framing it as a noble sacrifice. They were sealing my fate in front of the exact judges who would quietly stamp the forged legal paperwork tomorrow morning. We understand that this is a massive transition, Preston continued smoothly, easily falling into the complex financial jargon he had secretly memorized from my stolen private files. We will be aggressively restructuring our primary asset management strategies and initiating several major liquidity events by tomorrow morning to instantly stabilize the firm. I want to personally assure every single shareholder in this room that your investments are entirely safe under my new leadership. We will uphold the strict fiduciary duty that Victoria established, while completely modernizing our approach to global capital acquisition. The firm is entering a highly profitable new era under our direct legal guidance. The private equity bankers standing near the front rows nodded their heads in greedy approval. They knew exactly what his promise of major liquidity events meant. It meant Preston was going to rapidly sell off my most valuable assets for pennies on the dollar to quickly generate the $40 million in liquid cash my father desperately needed to save his bankrupt real estate empire. The remaining billions would be evenly split between them exactly as their secret legal term sheet dictated. It was the perfect invisible crime executed entirely out in the open. Preston reached out and picked up a delicate crystal champagne flute from the edge of the mahogany podium. He raised the glass high into the warm golden light of the chandeliers. The entire room immediately followed his lead, with 400 guests silently raising their expensive drinks into the air. The heavy crystal glasses caught the light, creating a sparkling ocean of false celebration. "I want to propose a very special toast tonight," Preston said, his eyes scanning the massive crowd before slowly locking directly onto mine. "To my incredible wife, Victoria. You fought a brilliant, fearless battle in the corporate world for 15 years, and you built a legacy that will absolutely stand the test of time. You have given me everything, and now it is my ultimate privilege to carry your heavy burden for you. You can finally rest, darling. We have absolutely everything under control." The audience broke into a loud, sustained round of enthusiastic applause. They were eagerly clapping for my professional funeral. They were happily cheering for the handsome, charming man who was confidently promising to make them all incredibly rich by morning. Preston took a slow, satisfying sip of his vintage champagne, staring down at me with a look of absolute, unadulterated triumph. He genuinely believed he had just successfully crossed the finish line. He thought his public performance had completely trapped me, and that I was now nothing more than a wealthy, silent ghost, sitting in a velvet chair, forever imprisoned in my own home. I did not touch the glass of water resting on the crisp white tablecloth in front of me. I simply sat perfectly still, keeping my hands elegantly folded in my lap. I let the loud, aggressive applause wash completely over me, absorbing the profound arrogance and the blind greed radiating from every single corner of the grand ballroom. I watched Preston's chest heave with excited adrenaline as he smiled brightly at the clapping investors. I watched my father's pale face slowly regain its color as he falsely believed his massive toxic debt was finally erased by this grand public deception. They had spoken their pretty lies, and they had successfully claimed their fake victory. They had demanded this grand public stage, and I had patiently allowed them to build it as high as they possibly could. I waited quietly for the loud applause to naturally fade away. I waited for the heavy silence to slowly return to the room. And then I calmly wrapped my fingers around the smooth carbon fiber handle of my black cane, ready to finally deliver the lethal strike. The deafening applause slowly began to fade, echoing away into the high vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. Preston lowered his crystal champagne flute, still wearing that sickeningly triumphant smile, completely unaware that his entire universe was about to violently collapse. I placed my hands firmly on the smooth padded armrests of the velvet chair and pushed myself up to a standing position. The sudden movement sent a blinding spike of raw agony shooting directly through my shattered right knee, but I refused to let my physical body betray my iron will. I gripped the black carbon fiber cane securely in my right hand and took a slow, deliberate step toward the mahogany podium. The lingering murmurs in the massive crowd instantly died out, replaced by a heavy, breathless silence, as 400 wealthy guests watched the supposedly brain-damaged woman move with absolute, calculated precision. Preston saw me approaching, and his handsome face immediately flushed with a sudden panicked heat. He quickly set his glass down and stepped directly into my path, attempting to physically block my access to the microphone. "Victoria, darling," he whispered aggressively, his voice dropping into a harsh, vicious hiss that only I could hear. "What are you doing? Sit back down immediately before you embarrass yourself." I did not stop walking. I simply raised my dark eyes and locked my gaze directly onto his, completely freezing the blood in his veins. My stare was completely devoid of the warm, trusting love he had exploited for 5 years. It was the dark, merciless stare of an apex predator, completely cornered and ready to slaughter. "Move out of my way, Preston," I commanded softly, the tone radiating a lethal, freezing authority. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his arrogant confidence momentarily faltering under the crushing weight of my absolute resolve. That tiny hesitation was all I needed. I stepped smoothly around him, gracefully sliding my left hand over the smooth wood of the podium and firmly wrapping my fingers around the sleek silver stem of the microphone. I pulled the microphone slightly closer to my mouth, turning my attention entirely to the sea of silent, terrified faces staring up at me. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting with crystal clear perfection across the massive ballroom. "I want to sincerely thank my husband for that incredibly creative and highly dramatic performance. He has always possessed a remarkable talent for spinning beautiful, captivating fiction." A loud collective gasp rippled through the front rows. The wealthy private equity bankers and the corrupt politicians shifted nervously in their expensive seats, suddenly realizing that the woman standing before them was absolutely not suffering from any form of cognitive decline. My speech was entirely flawless, perfectly articulated, and completely devoid of the heavy chemical sedation my father had promised them. I reached down into the hidden waterproof compartment of my fiberglass cast and smoothly withdrew the black plastic burner phone. I had already synchronized the device with the master audiovisual network of the estate earlier this afternoon. I simply tapped the master override icon on the glowing screen. Instantly, the romantic classical lighting in the ballroom dimmed, and the 3 massive digital projection screens positioned directly behind the podium roared to life, casting a bright, harsh white light over the entire stage. "If you are going to publicly execute a hostile takeover of a billion-dollar venture capital firm," I continued smoothly, tapping another command into the secure application, "I highly recommend doing basic preliminary due diligence." Preston just proudly announced that he is assuming absolute financial control of my corporate portfolio through an emergency medical conservatorship. He is relying on a highly fabricated psychiatric evaluation completely paid for by my father. I paused for a moment, letting the heavy gravity of my words sink into the silent crowd. I glanced sideways at my father, Richard. He was gripping the edge of the front table so tightly, his knuckles were completely white, his breathing shallow and rapid. I turned back to the crowd. Unfortunately for Preston, a medical conservatorship only grants legal authority over the personal assets explicitly owned by the incapacitated individual. I tapped the screen of my phone, and the massive digital displays behind me instantly populated with the crisp legal pages of the master document Marcus Hayes had drafted. As of 3 hours ago, I announced, my voice ringing with cold, triumphant finality, I legally transferred every single voting share, every proprietary corporate algorithm, and every liquid financial asset I possess into an irrevocable living trust. I do not personally own a single dollar to my name anymore. Therefore, the fraudulent conservatorship my husband is currently holding is absolutely legally worthless. The massive room erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked whispers and outraged muttering. The greedy investors who had eagerly anticipated a massive fire sale of my corporate assets suddenly realized the enormous vault was entirely empty. Preston physically stumbled backward, his face draining of all color as he stared up at the massive screens. He frantically read the complex legal jargon, his eyes widening in absolute terror as he recognized the unbreakable legal structures I had perfectly deployed against him. But wait, there is a significantly more beautiful detail, I added, cutting sharply through the rising noise of the crowd. Because I wanted to ensure my massive portfolio remained completely protected from aggressive, greedy parasites, I legally appointed a sole external trustee to manage the entire estate. I tapped the phone again, and the screen zoomed in closely on the final signature page displaying the boldly printed name of the new legal guardian of my empire. That trustee is Marcus Hayes, Preston's own brother, and Marcus currently holds absolute, unmitigated fiduciary control over my entire life's work. Preston let out a choked, strangled sound that was half gasp and half sob. The profound realization that his estranged, fiercely principled African-American brother now legally controlled the massive fortune he had just tried to steal completely shattered his fragile, arrogant ego. He looked exactly like a drowning man, desperately searching for a life raft that did not exist. My father lunged forward, his face twisted in a mask of pure, desperate rage. "Victoria, stop this insane display immediately." Richard demanded loudly, his booming voice cracking under the immense pressure of his total public humiliation. "You are completely sick. You do not know what you are saying." He tried to reach for the microphone, but I swiftly pulled it completely out of his reach, stepping back and leaning my weight firmly onto the carbon fiber cane. "I am not quite finished, Richard." I warned, my voice dropping into a dark, threatening register that completely silenced his pathetic outburst. I turned my attention back to the captivated audience. You might be wondering why my loving husband and my deeply concerned father would go to such incredible criminal lengths to legally imprison me inside this house. The answer is remarkably simple and entirely pathetic. It is just money. I tapped the burner phone again, and the trust documents vanished from the giant screens, instantly replaced by a complex spiderweb of highly classified financial wire transfers and heavily audited corporate ledgers. "Let us look at my father's legendary commercial real estate empire," I suggested smoothly, using the phone to highlight a massive column of terrifying red numbers. Richard Sterling has completely bankrupted our family legacy. He is currently carrying over $300 million in highly toxic, unregulated debt. By tomorrow morning, he is legally scheduled to default on 3 massive private equity loans, effectively triggering a total corporate liquidation. The wealthy investors in the crowd immediately began pulling out their own cell phones, furiously texting their brokers and legal teams to completely distance themselves from the Sterling family name. The social contagion of financial ruin was spreading through the ballroom like a highly aggressive virus. To prevent this massive public humiliation, I explained, projecting my voice over the rising chaos, my father desperately needed an immediate injection of exactly $40 million in liquid cash. But because his credit is completely destroyed, he decided to simply steal it directly from my venture capital firm. The screen shifted again, displaying the exact digital routing numbers and the forged authorization logs from the internal servers of my company. This morning, Preston attempted to forcefully wire $40 million of my corporate funds directly into a hidden shell company located in the Cayman Islands. And why would my charming husband eagerly facilitate such a massive federal crime? I tapped the screen one more time, revealing the highly confidential incorporation documents of a Delaware limited liability company, because Preston negotiated a very specific legal term sheet. In exchange for successfully locking me in a heavily medicated psychiatric prison, Preston was legally guaranteed a full 50% cut of my entire liquidated billion-dollar portfolio. He was planning to happily divorce me tomorrow and walk away with half of my life's work. The profound silence that followed this massive revelation was absolute and completely terrifying. The high society elite of the city were not just witnessing a simple family dispute. They were watching the live, meticulous dissection of a colossal financial conspiracy. They were looking directly at the undeniable digital proof of massive federal wire fraud and aggressive corporate embezzlement. The corrupt judge standing near the caviar station had gone completely pale, rapidly backing away from my father and attempting to silently vanish into the thick crowd. The elegant facade of the charity gala was entirely destroyed, leaving only the ugly, raw reality of their staggering criminal greed. Preston was physically shaking now, his hands trembling violently as he stared at the glowing screens that detailed his exact unforgivable betrayal. He opened his mouth to speak, to loudly deny the absolute truth staring him in the face, but absolutely no words came out. He was completely suffocated by the heavy, crushing weight of his monumental failure. But stealing my money was only their secondary strategy. I said, my voice suddenly dropping into a chilling, deadly whisper that somehow amplified the pure terror in the room. The massive screens behind me suddenly went completely black, plunging the stage into a brief, heavy darkness. I took a deep, slow breath, feeling the cold, absolute fury radiating from my shattered ribs and my broken knee. I looked directly into Preston's terrified eyes, and then I looked at my father. You see, the medical conservatorship was simply a hasty backup plan because their original strategy did not quite work out exactly as they intended. I tapped the glowing screen of the burner phone for the absolute final time. The massive projectors roared back to life, displaying 3 high-resolution, intensely detailed forensic photographs taken directly from the state police impound lot. The images clearly showed the dark, greasy undercarriage of my completely totaled sports car, focusing directly on the primary hydraulic brake cylinder. 3 weeks ago, I was driving down the Pacific Coast Highway in a severe rainstorm. I recounted my voice completely devoid of any emotion, perfectly mimicking the detached, analytical tone of a lead prosecutor delivering a closing argument. When I reached the steepest, most dangerous curve on the cliffs, my brakes completely failed. The local police department conveniently classified the brutal crash as a tragic mechanical malfunction. But as you can all clearly see on the massive screens behind me, the thick steel braided brake line did not simply rupture under pressure. The crowd gasped collectively, a wave of absolute visceral horror sweeping through the room as the wealthy guests stared closely at the forensic images. The thick hydraulic hose had a perfectly clean surgical incision, slicing halfway through the durable material. It was a deliberate, calculated cut designed to slowly leak brake fluid until the system entirely failed at the absolute worst possible moment. They did not just want to legally steal my venture capital firm. I stated, my voice ringing with total, absolute authority and lethal finality. They actively wanted me dead. If I had died in that terrible crash, Preston would have automatically inherited my entire massive fortune as my legal surviving spouse. He would have quietly paid off my father's toxic debt, and they both would have walked away completely rich and entirely clean. But I survived. I miraculously survived their calculated murder attempt. So they locked me inside this house, heavily drugged my tea, and proudly organized this lavish charity gala to confidently dance on my professional grave. The room was entirely paralyzed by shock. Women were covering their mouths in pure terror, and men were staring at Preston and Richard with absolute, undisguised disgust. They were no longer looking at failed businessmen. They were looking directly at desperate, attempted murderers. I stood perfectly tall behind the podium, leaning gracefully on my black cane, the heavy vintage emeralds catching the bright stage lights. The microphone drop was complete. The absolute total destruction of their entire world was now publicly broadcast, documented, and entirely undeniable. I had promised myself I would completely burn their arrogant reality straight to the ground, and as I watched the sheer absolute panic consume their pale faces, I knew the glorious fire was already raging completely out of control. Preston stood entirely paralyzed behind the heavy mahogany podium, staring blankly at the massive digital screens that brilliantly broadcasted his unforgivable crimes. The horrific reality of his absolute failure finally crashed down upon him, completely crushing his arrogant posture. My father, however, reacted with the desperate, violent panic of a completely cornered animal. Richard violently shoved past Preston, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, aggressive rage. He frantically grabbed the sleek digital control panel resting on the edge of the wooden podium, desperately mashing his heavy fingers against the glass screen. He was aggressively trying to cut the main power supply to the ballroom, to plunge the room into absolute darkness, and somehow hide the massive forensic photographs of my severed brake lines. But I had already anticipated his highly predictable cowardice. The audiovisual system was completely locked out, entirely controlled by the encrypted burner phone resting safely in the palm of my hand. The bright white light from the massive projectors continued to wash over his sweating, terrified face, perfectly illuminating his total destruction for the 400 wealthy guests to witness. The elite crowd was completely frozen in absolute horror, entirely unable to look away from the spectacular collapse of the Sterling family empire. The corrupt local judge, who was supposed to happily sign my fraudulent conservatorship tomorrow morning, was already frantically sprinting toward the side exit, desperately trying to save his own compromised career. Just as Richard aggressively raised his heavy fist to physically smash the glass control panel into pieces, a massive booming sound violently shattered the tense, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. The towering heavy oak doors at the primary entrance of the estate were thrown completely open, hitting the expensive plaster walls with a deafening, violent crack. Every single head in the massive room instantly snapped toward the back of the hall. Standing perfectly framed in the grand entryway was Marcus Hayes. My brilliant African-American brother-in-law looked like the absolute physical embodiment of divine justice. He was wearing an immaculate, dark-tailored suit, his broad posture radiating a terrifying cold authority that instantly commanded absolute obedience from the entire chaotic room. He did not look like a corporate litigator, arriving for a simple civil dispute. He looked exactly like an apex predator, stepping confidently onto his own hunting ground to claim his rightful kill. And he was absolutely not alone tonight. Flanking Marcus on both sides, spreading out rapidly into a highly coordinated tactical formation, were a dozen heavily armed federal agents. They wore dark, heavy windbreakers, clearly emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The wealthy private equity bankers and the corrupt local politicians immediately scrambled backward, practically climbing over the expensive catering tables to aggressively distance themselves from my father and my husband. The heavy tactical boots of the federal agents echoed loudly against the imported marble floor as they cut a wide, clear path straight down the center of the room, directly toward the grand podium. Marcus walked slowly behind them, his dark eyes entirely locked onto the pale, terrified face of his younger brother. Preston began to physically shake, vibrating with a pathetic, whimpering terror, as he watched his estranged brother confidently dismantle his entire criminal reality. Marcus finally stopped at the very base of the grand staircase, standing perfectly tall under the bright crystal chandeliers. He smoothly pulled a thick stack of folded legal documents from the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, Richard Sterling and Preston Hayes. Marcus announced his deep, powerful voice, effortlessly projecting across the massive, silent ballroom without any need for a microphone. I am holding sealed emergency federal warrants issued directly by the United States District Court. You are both being placed under immediate arrest for massive federal wire fraud, aggressive corporate embezzlement, and highly premeditated conspiracy to commit murder across state lines. My father let out a sudden, sharp gasp, clutching his chest as if the heavy legal words had physically struck him. His massive, inflated ego instantly deflated entirely, reducing the towering real estate tycoon to a pathetic, trembling, old man. Two federal agents quickly marched up the short wooden steps to the main stage. One agent firmly grabbed my father's expensive, tailored tuxedo, twisting his arms aggressively behind his back. The loud, sharp click of the heavy steel handcuffs, snapping tightly closed, echoed violently through the quiet ballroom. Richard did not fight back or offer a single word of protest. He simply stared blankly down at the polished marble floor, completely destroyed by the sudden, horrific realization that he was absolutely going to die in a federal prison cell. The second agent moved directly toward Preston. My handsome, charming husband completely broke down. The arrogant, charismatic facade he had weaponized for 5 successful years entirely dissolved, leaving absolutely nothing but a desperate, terrified coward. He fell heavily to his knees right on the main stage, practically begging the federal agent for mercy. He turned his head frantically, searching the silent crowd until his wide, panicked eyes finally locked onto mine. "Victoria, please!" Preston violently sobbed, his perfectly styled hair, now a chaotic, messy tangle of pure distress. Please, tell them it is a massive mistake, darling. We are legally married, Victoria. You have to save me. Please do not let them take me away. I sat perfectly still in my plush velvet chair, resting my hands elegantly on my black carbon fiber cane. I looked down at the pathetic, crying man kneeling on the stage, wearing the expensive tuxedo my hard-earned corporate money had bought him. I did not feel a single drop of pity or sorrow or regret. I felt completely and entirely free. I leaned slightly forward, looking directly into his tear-filled eyes. You should have checked the brake lines twice. Preston, I whispered coldly, my voice carrying just enough to reach his ears before the federal agent violently hauled him up to his feet. The agent aggressively snapped the heavy steel cuffs around Preston's wrists, completely ignoring his loud, pathetic wailing. Marcus stepped forward and offered me a brief, perfectly respectful nod of absolute triumph. The grand charity gala my father had so carefully organized to publicly celebrate my total destruction had flawlessly transformed into the spectacular public execution of his own criminal empire. I sat quietly in my beautiful midnight blue silk gown, proudly wearing my mother's vintage emeralds, and watched with deep, immense satisfaction as the federal agents marched my husband and my father straight out of the grand ballroom and directly into the cold, dark night. The morning after the grand charity gala, the entire financial landscape of the city was completely unrecognizable. The spectacular federal arrests of Richard Sterling and Preston Hayes had totally dominated the late-night global news cycle, and by the time the stock market officially opened the following morning, the catastrophic corporate fallout was absolutely absolute. I woke up in my quiet, high-security penthouse apartment downtown, having finally left the suffocating family estate in the back of a black, armored town car, the exact moment the federal agents secured the premises. For the very first time in 3 agonizing weeks, I did not have to pretend to swallow a heavy, toxic sedative, and I did not have to manufacture a pathetic, weak smile for the incredibly arrogant men who actively wanted me dead. My shattered knee was finally healing properly under the expert care of a legitimate orthopedic surgeon, and my mind was entirely clear and dangerously sharp. I sat at my sleek glass dining table, drinking a cup of hot black coffee and watching the morning financial news networks completely tear my father's massive legacy to absolute shreds. The heavily leveraged commercial real estate empire Richard had spent 4 decades ruthlessly building was evaporating right in front of the world on live television. Marcus Hayes arrived at my penthouse precisely at 9 o'clock that morning, carrying a thick leather briefcase entirely filled with the devastating legal wreckage of his brother's monumental arrogance. Marcus did not offer any empty emotional apologies for Preston's horrific violent behavior, because we both understood that business was strictly business and the legal retribution was already in perfect lethal motion. He sat across from me and laid out the exact forensic timeline for the complete systematic dismantling of the Sterling family holding companies. Because the Federal Bureau of Investigation had seized all of Richard's internal corporate servers, the corrupt local county judge, who had eagerly planned to approve my fraudulent medical conservatorship, immediately panicked and officially threw the entire psychiatric case completely out of court. The forged medical evaluation, signed by Dr. Evans, was instantly flagged as primary federal evidence in a massive corporate conspiracy investigation. The disgraced, corrupt doctor was promptly arrested by federal marshals while desperately attempting to board a one-way international flight to South America later that same afternoon. The entire criminal apparatus they had meticulously built to steal my venture capital firm was entirely, completely demolished in less than 24 hours. Furthermore, Marcus had successfully filed emergency federal injunctions to completely freeze all of Preston's private checking accounts, entirely cutting off his access to the expensive lawyers he so desperately needed to defend himself. But the absolute most satisfying phase of the Strategic Justice Protocol was the aggressive corporate financial restructuring that rapidly followed over the next 3 weeks. As the sole legal trustee of my impenetrable, irrevocable living trust, Marcus flawlessly executed a series of devastating corporate maneuvers that entirely isolated my massive wealth from the rapidly sinking ship of my father's bankrupt company. My venture capital firm held an emergency board meeting where the completely terrified directors unanimously pledged their absolute, unquestioning loyalty to my leadership. We sat back and watched quietly as the aggressive private equity groups my father had desperately defrauded finally realized they were never getting their $300 million back. They instantly declared a total default on his massive high-interest commercial loans. The aggressive corporate foreclosure process that Richard had violently tried to avoid by illegally stealing my money was immediately triggered on a massive, extremely public scale. The major national banks ruthlessly called in every single one of his remaining corporate credit lines, entirely freezing his working capital and violently forcing his flagship commercial properties into immediate federal receivership. I did not just want to sit back and quietly watch him lose his massive real estate empire. I wanted to actively own the very ground he used to proudly walk on. As the highly publicized commercial foreclosure auctions began sweeping across the state, I quietly directed my venture capital firm to establish 3 entirely anonymous corporate shell companies legally registered in Delaware. These invisible holding companies were completely funded by the massive liquid assets safely protected inside my living trust. While the rest of the city falsely believed I was quietly recovering from my severe physical trauma in absolute privacy, I was actually sitting in my high-rise corner office, ruthlessly commanding a massive aggressive real estate acquisition strategy. I instructed my senior acquisitions team to aggressively target the exact commercial properties my father had always prized the absolute most. Because the entire commercial real estate market was deeply terrified of the highly toxic Sterling family name, the public auction bids were incredibly remarkably low. My anonymous shell companies swooped in and legally purchased my father's entire downtown portfolio for literally pennies on the actual dollar. I successfully acquired his towering glass office buildings, his luxury coastal residential developments, and his sprawling commercial retail centers at a massive catastrophic discount. But the absolute crown jewel of my aggressive corporate acquisition strategy was the primary family estate itself. The massive sprawling ancestral mansion where I had spent my entire childhood and where my father had cruelly imprisoned me for 3 terrifying weeks was heavily mortgaged to a ruthless private banking institution. When Richard was suddenly thrown into a cold federal holding cell, the massive monthly mortgage payments entirely stopped. The private bank immediately seized the spectacular property and quietly listed it for a rapid off-market private sale to quickly recoup their heavy financial losses. I did not even bother to negotiate with them directly. Marcus simply submitted a single massive all-cash offer through one of our highly secure anonymous trusts, perfectly undercutting the current market value by 40%. The desperate banking executives happily accepted the clean wire transfer within 2 hours, completely unaware they were selling the Sterling estate directly back to the very woman Richard had tried to murder. 4 weeks after the explosive charity gala, I officially returned to the massive family estate. The heavy fiberglass cast had finally been entirely removed from my right leg, completely replaced by a sleek, low-profile medical brace that allowed me to walk with a slow, smooth, highly calculated confidence. I did not need the black carbon fiber cane anymore, but I kept it securely locked in my home office closet as a beautiful, dark reminder of the night I completely destroyed my enemies. I walked through the towering front oak doors of the grand mansion completely alone. The suffocating heavy atmosphere of dark dread and chemical sedation that had previously haunted these expansive, elegant halls was entirely gone. The massive house felt incredibly light, perfectly clean, and absolutely wonderfully silent. I immediately hired a premium private estate liquidation team to completely purge the massive property of any remaining physical evidence that Richard Sterling or Preston Hayes had ever existed within these walls. I stood in the grand marble foyer and watched with immense quiet satisfaction as the aggressive moving crews quickly carried out my father's heavy antique mahogany desk, the exact same desk where he had proudly poured expensive scotch to celebrate my forged medical demise. I watched them completely clear out. Preston's luxurious guest suite, violently throwing his custom-tailored Italian suits, his expensive imported cologne, and his heavy gold luxury watches into cheap black plastic garbage bags. The massive oil portrait of my father that had hung proudly in the main dining room was unceremoniously ripped from the plaster wall and completely destroyed. Every single item purchased with my stolen corporate wealth or bought using my father's toxic commercial debt was ruthlessly removed from the premises and immediately donated to a local city charity shelter. I completely meticulously erased their arrogant male presence from the beautiful architecture of my absolute home. Later that same afternoon, I stood entirely alone in the grand empty study, where I had first discovered their horrific midnight betrayal. The room was now entirely stripped of its dark, heavy leather furniture and thick, disgusting cigar smoke. It smelled only of fresh lemon polish and clean, crisp autumn air blowing in through the open garden windows. The heavy oak doors were thrown wide open, and the warm golden sunlight poured freely across the expensive imported marble floors. A sleek black town car pulled into the long circular driveway outside, and my private legal courier walked quickly up the front steps, carrying a heavy, thick manila envelope. I signed the secure delivery manifest and slowly opened the thick, crisp parchment paper inside. It was the official finalized quitclaim deed to the massive estate and the comprehensive legal title documents for the entire commercial real estate portfolio my father had spectacularly lost. I ran my fingertips slowly over the raised golden seal of the county clerk, absolutely confirming my total legal dominance over the entire empire. The name Richard Sterling was completely permanently erased from the ownership history of the massive property. The name Preston Hayes was absolutely nowhere to be found on any document. The vast, sprawling estate, the expensive downtown office towers, and the highly lucrative coastal developments were now all legally owned entirely and exclusively by my private, irrevocable trust. I had successfully transformed the exact legal weapons they used to try and completely destroy me into the very foundation of my new, massive financial empire. I walked slowly out onto the grand marble terrace, overlooking the perfectly manicured rolling green lawns of the massive backyard. I poured myself a single, elegant glass of vintage French Bordeaux from the private wine cellar, perfectly enjoying the rich, complex taste of absolute total victory. I had not just miraculously survived their brutal, calculated attempt on my life. I had methodically, legally, and absolutely consumed their entire fraudulent reality. I had taken the tragic, broken victim narrative they had so carefully constructed for me, and I had violently shattered it completely over their arrogant heads. I was no longer the obedient, silent daughter of a corrupt real estate tycoon, and I was absolutely no longer the wealthy, blind wife of a charismatic financial parasite. I was the absolute sole sovereign of a massive billion-dollar corporate empire, sitting completely untouched and untouchable in the beautiful, quiet castle I had rightfully reclaimed. The legal fallout was absolutely complete, and the aggressive financial seizure was entirely flawless. Now it was finally time to quietly visit the terrified men who were currently rotting away in a cold federal prison and proudly show them exactly who owned their entire world. The steel doors of the detention center slammed shut behind me with a loud, hollow echo sounding like finality. I walked down the sterile corridor, ignoring the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off the dull concrete walls. My custom charcoal power suit and black leather heels stood in sharp contrast to the bleak environment. I was the undisputed ruler of a corporate empire, walking confidently into a high-security cage to examine the two desperate animals who had foolishly tried to slaughter me. A female guard unlocked a heavy metal door, ushering me into a windowless visitation room. The room smelled faintly of chemical bleach and despair. I sat down in the cold metal chair, folding my hands perfectly on the scratched steel table. The heavy door on the opposite side buzzed loudly and opened. 2 armed federal guards escorted my father, Richard, and my husband, Preston, directly into the cramped space. Their physical deterioration was breathtaking. They had been stripped of their custom tuxedos, their gold watches, and their carefully crafted facades. They were wearing faded orange cotton jumpsuits that swallowed their previously confident postures. My father looked as though he had aged 20 years in 4 short weeks. His silver hair was a chaotic, greasy mess, and his pale skin hung loosely around his hollow cheekbones. Without his real estate empire to prop up his enormous ego, he was nothing but a fragile, exhausted old man. Preston looked significantly worse. The handsome charm he had weaponized to successfully infiltrate my life and bank accounts was entirely eradicated. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, darting around the small room with a frantic, pathetic energy. His hands were trembling as he awkwardly sat down directly across from me. The steel chains binding their wrists clinked loudly against the metal table, serving as a melodic reminder of their permanent failure. For a long, heavy moment, nobody spoke a word. The suffocating silence stretched tightly across the small room, vibrating with their monumental defeat. Preston was the first one to break. He leaned forward, his chained hands shaking violently against the scratched metal surface. "How long did you know Victoria?" he whispered, his voice cracking into a desperate rasp, devoid of confidence. "We planned every detail so perfectly. We had Dr. Evans and the local judges completely secured. You were sedated every single day. You were isolated. I do not understand how you managed to completely dismantle our entire structure without us noticing a single thing." My father slowly raised his head, his dark, sunken eyes burning with a mixture of bitter hatred and terrified curiosity. "Yes, Victoria Richard," rasped his voice, sounding like dry, crushed gravel. "Tell us exactly how you brilliantly outsmarted us from a locked bedroom with a shattered leg." I looked back and forth between the 2 broken men, absorbing their pathetic confusion. I let a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. "You both made one catastrophic, fundamental error," I said, my voice perfectly steady and radiating a cold authority. "You believed your own arrogant lies. You looked at me, and you only saw what you desperately wanted to see. You saw a weak, emotional woman entirely broken by a tragic accident, but you forgot that I am the same ruthless venture capitalist who built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. You underestimated my intellect, and that was your absolute fatal flaw." I leaned closer, keeping my eyes locked onto Preston's terrified face. The first night my father forcefully moved me back into the family estate, he brought me a cup of hot chamomile tea and a white sleeping pill. He watched my throat incredibly closely to make sure I swallowed it down. I paused for a brief second, letting the silence amplify my revelation. But I never swallowed that pill, Preston. I securely hid it under my tongue until my father proudly walked out of the bedroom. The color drained from Preston's face, transforming his skin into a terrifying, ghastly white. My father flinched violently, his chains rattling loudly against the metal table as the horrific realization finally struck him. I spit the bitter capsule into a soft tissue. I continued, my tone dropping into a dark, methodical rhythm. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, I crept out of my bed and walked quietly down the wooden staircase. I stood hidden in the dark hallway outside the mahogany study. I watched the 2 of you clinking your crystal Scotch glasses together in the warm firelight. I listened closely while you openly discussed the forged psychiatric evaluation, the offshore wire transfers, and your criminal partnership. I knew about your entire conspiracy from the first night. Every tear I cried, every weak panic attack I suffered, and every moment of drugged confusion I displayed over those 3 long weeks was a calculated, absolute performance. I was completely awake. I was entirely aware. And I was meticulously planning your total, absolute destruction while you were happily measuring the expensive drapes for my corporate funeral. Preston let out a choked, agonizing sob, dropping his face into his chained hands as the sheer magnitude of his stupidity finally crushed him. My father simply stared at me with wide, terrified, empty eyes, paralyzed by the flawless trap he had blindly walked directly into. You cut the brake lines on my sports car because you arrogantly thought I was a simple obstacle you could easily remove, I stated firmly, standing up gracefully from the cold metal chair and smoothing the crisp fabric of my charcoal suit. But you only succeeded in removing yourselves from the civilized world. I never want to see either of your faces again. Enjoy the rest of your pathetic lives in this beautiful cage, gentlemen. I turned my back on the sobbing men, ignoring their frantic pleas echoing behind me. I walked confidently out of the sterile visitation room, the heavy steel doors slamming securely shut with satisfying absolute finality, permanently locking my attempted murderers inside their dark, empty nightmare. 6 months later, the thick winter clouds parted to reveal a brilliant, clear spring sky over the sprawling city skyline. I stood perfectly still behind the massive glass walls of my newly renovated corner office on the 60th floor. The heavy fiberglass cast and restrictive medical brace were completely gone, replaced by a pair of sharp black designer stilettos that I wore with effortless command. My shattered right knee had healed flawlessly, leaving only a tiny invisible silver scar serving as a quiet private reminder of the brutal war I had successfully won. The physical pain that once threatened to consume me in that dark locked bedroom was now a distant, fading memory, completely overshadowed by the terrifying power I had legally secured. My venture capital firm had aggressively expanded, absorbing the massive market void left behind by my corrupt father's spectacular downfall. I was no longer just the highly successful managing partner of an investment portfolio. I was the absolute, undisputed queen of a colossal financial empire that entirely dictated the economic heartbeat of the city. The frosted glass door to my executive suite swung open silently. Marcus Hayes walked into the expansive room, his presence immediately radiating the exact same lethal corporate authority that had saved my life on the night of the charity gala. My brilliant African-American brother-in-law looked perfectly at home in the high-stakes environment of my venture capital firm, wearing an immaculate, custom-tailored navy suit that commanded immediate respect. He was no longer just an outside operative or a temporary proxy trustee. 3 months ago, I had officially appointed Marcus as the permanent chief legal counsel of my entire corporate umbrella. We had spent the last 6 months aggressively restructuring the massive commercial real estate portfolio I had ruthlessly acquired from my father's federal bankruptcy auction. We had fired every single corrupt executive my father had previously employed, and we had systematically replaced them with ruthless, brilliant analysts who answered exclusively to me. Marcus walked directly over to my massive polished obsidian desk, dropping a thick, heavy leather portfolio onto the smooth glass surface. The final liquidation of the offshore Cayman accounts is absolutely complete. Victoria Marcus announced, his deep, resonant voice filling the quiet executive suite. The federal authorities successfully recovered the last remaining fractions of the hidden capital Richard attempted to steal. Every single dollar has been fully repatriated and directly deposited into your primary holding trust, exactly as we planned. Furthermore, the presiding federal judge officially finalized the maximum sentencing guidelines for both of them this morning. Richard will spend the next 25 years in a maximum security facility, and Preston received a mandatory 30-year sentence without any possibility of early parole. They have both been permanently removed from the financial ecosystem, and your legal divorce was formally finalized and sealed an hour ago. You are entirely, completely free. I turned away from the towering glass window and walked slowly toward my desk, the sharp, rhythmic click of my stilettos echoing with heavy finality across the polished hardwood floor. I looked down at the thick legal portfolio Marcus had delivered, completely absorbing the absolute magnitude of our total victory. The men who had arrogantly cut the brake lines on my sports car and happily toasted to my heavily sedated demise were now erased from my reality. They were ghosts locked inside a concrete cage, entirely stripped of their expensive suits, their unearned wealth, and their pathetic manufactured pride. I gently rested my hand on the cool leather of the portfolio, feeling a profound, deep sense of absolute closure wash over my entire body. We did not just legally survive their horrific betrayal, Marcus, I said softly, my voice echoing with a calm, deadly satisfaction. We took their massive arrogance and we weaponized it to completely conquer their entire world. Marcus offered a slow, deeply respectful nod, his dark eyes reflecting a profound mutual understanding forged directly in the fires of our shared corporate warfare. "You built a magnificent fortress, Victoria," he replied smoothly, his tone carrying the deep weight of a seasoned legal general admiring a perfectly executed campaign. "You transformed a massive, tragic betrayal into the greatest financial acquisition this city has ever witnessed. And you did it all with flawless precision. I will leave you to review the final settlement documents. Enjoy the beautiful view this evening, Victoria, because you have absolutely earned every single inch of it." Marcus turned and walked confidently out of the executive suite, the heavy glass door clicking softly shut behind him, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet, expansive space of my absolute total triumph. I walked over to the sleek private bar tucked seamlessly into the corner of my office. I reached for a heavy crystal decanter and carefully poured a generous measure of exceptionally rare vintage French Bordeaux into a delicate glass goblet. The deep, rich ruby color of the expensive wine caught the warm, fading light of the late afternoon sun, perfectly mirroring the beautiful, bloody slaughter I had successfully executed on the corporate battlefield. I picked up the elegant glass and walked slowly back to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, magnificent city that stretched out endlessly beneath my feet. I could clearly see the towering commercial skyscrapers I now completely owned. I literally owned the very skyline my corrupt father had spent 4 decades desperately trying to conquer. The setting sun painted the high clouds in brilliant shades of bruised purple and burning gold, casting a magnificent warm glow over my beautiful new empire. I took a slow, satisfying sip of the vintage wine, letting the complex flavors perfectly settle on my tongue. I thought about the frightened, heavily medicated woman hiding a tiny white pill under her tongue. That broken woman was dead. The absolute greatest revenge is simply taking back your absolute power and living an extraordinarily beautiful life your enemies must simply watch forever.